Somewhere just off the shores of Toluca Lake, there exists a place unlike any other. A small, seemingly insignificant little burg. From a distance, this fog-draped ghost town reads like any other failed community you've likely seen on one of those particularly long, lonely road trips. However, this one, well, let's just say there's a few things that make it unique. Something draws you in here, something powerful and present, like it's just beyond your sight, waiting to be discovered. The ghostly visage you see before you is Silent Hill, a place and a series that quite literally changed me as a person. So I thought to myself, as the leaves fall from the trees and your breath starts to hang in the air, why don't we revisit that foggy little town, kick around the debris left behind, and try to figure out what the hell happened here? If you guys would be so kind as to join me, I'd like to comb through the boarded up storefronts, strange events, and ruined lives that call this place home. I don't know why, but something tells me we're supposed to be here. What's up, guys? I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to Silent Hill. Before we get into Silent Hill, we have to cover the events that led up to its creation. Events that, looking back now, seem kind of like a perfect storm, or maybe dominoes falling exactly into place. The year was 1996, and Capcom's Resident Evil was introducing PS1 owners to the concept of both survival horror and pants dripping wet with piss. Despite all the odds working against them, the Big C pulled out a huge hit with this entry-level attempt at making a 3D PS1 horror game, and Konami was quick to recognize that success. Their idea was to start development on a big Hollywood experience that would rival RE's market share, and for some reason they thought putting together a crew made up of members who didn't fit in or get along with anyone else at the company would get this monumentous job done. Thus, Team Silent was formed, and after that, well, a whole lot of nothing. Team members really had no idea how to create such a game and quickly lost enthusiasm to do so. They started batting around their own ideas and eventually decided the best course of action would be to play into a type of horror that wouldn't require a massive budget or cheap thrills. As a result, a more subdued and thought-provoking game was starting to take shape, one that sought to scare the player not by inundating them with visceral gore, but instead by building a world filled with vague, unexplainable horrors, a series of scares that would prey on the player's fear of the unknown and ill-defined. This was the idea that would eventually become survival horror's psychological counterpart and the birthplace of Silent Hill.
Hey, what are you talking about?
The plot of Silent Hill is one of contention, and for damn good reason. Writer Keiichiro Toyama was looking to create a scenario that both fulfilled the player's want for coherency, but also kept surface-level details to a minimum. And given the media that served as the game's inspiration, it's no wonder why the team elected to refrain from outright telling players what was happening in plain English. The idea was to encourage people to dig deeper for the whole story, and this would hopefully increase our connection to the events, since we were discovering them all for ourselves. Now don't get me wrong, this was an amazing approach and serves as one of the reasons the game is so fondly remembered to this day, but it did have one major downside. First-time players only finished the game once, and when left with unanswered questions, well, they just kind of made up their own.
Strength must overcome petty desire, childish sleep talk.
In the early days, this made for some very creepy and interesting what-if scenarios across forums and fan sites. But as time went on, these fan theories started to creep into legit discussions on the game's events. Even now, there's going to be a few of you watching who know some of these completely unfounded and inaccurate details to be gospel. So let's just get this out of the way right up front. During this story summary, I'm only going to be going off of what has been included in the game proper, or from official sources like quotes and interviews, confirmed to lead back to members of Team Silent. So if I don't mention your favorite aspect of the story, like multiple dimensions or the purposeful burning of Alessa, just know that's why. Alright, so now that that's settled, or at least it is as long as I'm the only one with the microphone here, let's stop with all the heavy stuff and move on to a more lighthearted subject matter like demonic cults and ancient Indian mysticism. Okay, so Silent Hill is the story of Harry Mason, a single dad taking his daughter on a trip to the titular little vacation town. On the way there, Harry swerves to miss someone in the road and accidentally crashes his Jeep. After waking up in a foggy, snow-ridden ghost town, Harry finds his daughter Cheryl is missing. While looking for her, Harry's caught up in a seductive, Jesus, a very seductive cult. While looking for her, Harry's caught up in a secretive cult looking to manipulate him for their own purposes.
I knew you'd come. You want the girl, right?
And a motorcycle cop who just wants to help. From here, the story becomes just as much about the game's setting as it is the game's characters, and we find that Silent Hill has its own little dark past, one that sets it apart from your average small American town, and that's about all you need to know. That's every little story beat from the game, only none of it's true. The entire setup I just fed you is completely inaccurate, and it was taken nearly word for word from most of the major Silent Hill resources you're likely to find with a quick Google search, further proving my earlier point. But before we talk about what's really going on here, I do have to give major spoiler warnings. And yeah, I know the game's nearly old enough to legally drive a car, but I do want new players to figure out things for themselves. So skip to the time code on screen to avoid having your mind blown with world-rending secrets. Alright, so to continue where we left off, my previous synopsis is what I like to call Silent Hill's little half-truth. I mean, sure, those events do happen, and that's an accurate description of them, but it's only half of what you're going to find behind that thick wall of fog. Yes, Harry Mason is the character we play as in this game, but its story isn't his, not by a long shot. See, Silent Hill is the story of Alessa, a little girl born into the town's secret demon-worshipping religious order. This cult preaches a creation story that had God returning to the heavens before she could finish making the world, leading to a corrupted and imperfect creation. According to their faith, God swore to one day return, and the most fanatical of this cult's membership is looking to speed that process up a little bit. Dahlia, current leader of the cult and mother to Alessa, one day gets the swell idea to use her own flesh and blood to aid in their God returning to create paradise, or as it would be known to sane people, hell on earth.
Herein lies the mother's womb, containing the power to create life.
The goal being to utilize her psychic abilities to facilitate the literal impregnation of her womb with God, a foolproof plan that could never fail, except that it did. During the process, the pain and stress of the ritual caused Alessa's powers to activate and blew up the house's boiler, starting a nasty blaze that burned her nearly to death. The pain and horror of the night's events caused Alessa to break herself in two both psychically and physically, leading to Cheryl's creation and her inability to finish the ritual. So as you might imagine, Harry returning to Silent Hill with Cheryl in tow is no accident. The cult needs Cheryl to reunite with Alessa so that their god can be born, and Alessa wants none of that. From the very beginning, her goal was to sacrifice herself so that the world would never turn into the hellish landscape the cult's aiming for. This condition's also the cause of one of the game's most famous elements, the Otherworld. The cult's been keeping Alessa alive despite her terrible wounds, and this causes them to never really heal. So this, combined with the demon currently housed within her, and a little help from the magic of Silent Hill, allow her thoughts to form the world around her. Harry's shifts into the Otherworld are merely Alessa losing control of her mind and allowing the darkest parts of her inner suffering out into the world. We're essentially just experiencing a physical manifestation of what's happening to this poor girl every day of her life. This means every monster you fight and every puzzle you solve is related to Alessa in one way or another, and this adds a whole new level of meaning to the game's world. So after that long explanation, Silent Hill is essentially the story of Alessa. It's her history and decisions that drive the plot, and we're entering her own personal hell when we shift into the other world. Sure, we may be controlling Harry the whole time, but his purpose is to act as our stand-in. After all, we're learning about all of this through him. Well, I think we've gone far enough into the weeds with this one. You think it's about time we let the noobs back in? Yeah, why not? Alright guys, welcome back. We definitely were not shit-talking you behind your back. Now, a deep and multivariate story is all well and good, but it can only be as interesting as the characters used to tell it, and this is another area where Team Silent really excelled.
My daughter will be the mother of God.
In most games, NPCs are used as expository dumps and cluing the player in on what's happening, and SH does something similar, but instead of outright informing you of the game's events, They strengthen the story's disorienting structure. The small handful of living, breathing people left in the town are all very strange and always end up posing more questions than they answer, sometimes by the mere fact that they exist. You're always going to leave a conversation in this game wondering why it felt so off, and sometimes you'll be left questioning whether the info you've been given can even be trusted. This leads to a nice little feeling I can only really describe thusly.
Am I right in thinking there is nobody else in this house?
No.
Then there is someone else in this house.
No, sorry. I said no, meaning yes.
No meaning yes? Look, I want a straight answer. Is there someone else or isn't there? Yes or no?
No.
No, there is or no, there isn't?
Yes.
Please!
Taken as a whole, Silent Hill's story is something you really don't see anymore. It trusted the player to discover it on their own and rewarded the curious with more and more details that could further contextualize the game's events. It's a dark tale that deals with a lot of heavy subject matter, but unlike modern games that take a similar route, Silent Hill doesn't cheapen it. The psychological and existential nature of the story is never used to shock the player. It simply is. These things exist and are happening in the world these characters inhabit. That's just the reality of it. As it goes on, there are plenty of times when we're told the exact opposite of the truth and led to believe things that run counter to the real story. And I don't know about you guys, but this had me questioning myself. Maybe me, Harry, or hell, both of us were just losing it, and the game's events were the result of our loosening grip on reality. This, in my opinion, is about as good as video game stories get. No on-the-nose commentary or blatant activism masquerading as a plot, just solid writing leading you through this winding supernatural path dotted with vaguely human figures hanging from meat hooks. Is there symbolism used to comment on real-world events or practices? Sure, maybe, but that's up to you. And I think that's why so many people have dreamed up their own conclusions to this story. The game just begs you to interpret it, but unlike most games, it never confirms or denies you either way. At least not until you really dig into it. Two casual players could finish the game and have completely different ideas of what happened, and it wouldn't be till one of them bolstered themselves and jumped back into these fog-laden streets that the truth would be shown to them. And even then, the ending they get might just undo all that work. Look, I'm really running my mouth here, and the point I'm trying to make is that Silent Hill is the standard for real, meaningful video game narratives, and you do yourself a disservice every day you don't experience it for yourself. As Silent Hill started its life as a clone of Resident Evil, you'd imagine they would play similarly, and, well, you'd be right, but you'd also be wrong. On the surface, it can seem like there are more similarities than differences, but even a few minutes worth of experience with the game would prove that incorrect. Sure, they might share the same outer body, but the guts moving that body around is where all the interesting stuff lies. Finally, a gross metaphor actually poignant given the context of the subject matter. I'm really starting to nail this whole writing thing. Okay, so on the surface, both games will have you exploring the environment, avoiding or engaging in combat, searching for puzzle pieces and keys to further facilitate exploration, but that's only half the story on Silent Hill's end. SH adds the bonus of a pretty ahead of its time open world kind of feel. Sure, it's not the go anywhere, do anything style of open world we're used to today, but nearly the entire town of Silent Hill is accessible early on, and thanks to scattered caches of ammo and health items, it's in your best interest to take advantage of that. The layout of events remains linear with locked doors and destroyed portions of road, keeping you from sequence break in the game, but an eerie unapproachableness and downright pristine design of the town will have you feeling compelled to explore as much as possible. Once inside one of the town's many interior areas, you'll see that typical RE gameplay come rearing its zombified head, but this time wearing a lot more hats. Exploration and progression is still the name of the game here, but more of an emphasis on realistic design guides a pretty cool take on the established norms of the genre. Most areas are filled to the brim with rooms, but you're not going to be able to get into even a quarter of them. Now, I know this sounds like it adds tedium into the survival horror mix, but to me, it just feels right. Before this video, I hadn't played Silent Hill 1 since I was about 10 years younger and nearly 80 pounds lighter. But this process of mashing the examine button on a row of 4 or 5 doors felt like slipping into a comfy old pair of pants. The good news is you're not going to have to keep track of the myriad locked and unlocked doors in any one place thanks to the next interesting addition to the formula. In RE games, maps were always nice to have around at first, but after a few hours in, even novice players would be navigating their surroundings with their eyes closed, only having to look up a location in a pinch. Silent Hill does a much better job of integrating its map into the gameplay and even makes it feel like a legitimate part of the game's world. As you explore, Harry will mark down any rooms of interest, locked doors, blocked passages, or puzzle locations. This makes it much easier to plot a course to your next destination, in spite of the added complications of less intuitive environmental layouts. When roaming around the streets of Silent Hill, this map becomes your beacon in the dark, since Harry also jots down the next place you should check out based on the information he's able to get from the very few people he comes across. And if there was one thing that just screamed, we no longer know how to make challenging and satisfying video games anymore, Silent Hill does all of this without leading you by the nose. And what I mean by that is, you feel like you've actually gotten to your destination thanks to your navigating skills. Sure, Harry may circle a spot on the map, but you're going to have to get there on foot. No on-screen directional cues or in-game guide to follow. You're going to have to plot out a route and remember to take that left at Matheson because you do not want to run into that pack of air screamers again. This was such a cool notion for me. Keeping track of what street I was on and keeping my destination in mind just felt so real life at the time. Like these were things I was just getting a hold of growing up in the heart of Miami, and now I was using that same skill to avoid demons from the abyss, one of the scariest environments I can imagine, so not much of a change there. And of course, we can't keep talking about the game's exploration without its other element being mentioned.
What's this?
Every so often, after certain events, Harry will cross over into what he calls the Other World, which is essentially the same area you've been exploring, except ran through the filter of the movie Hellraiser. In this twisted version of the world, open paths are now closed to you, hallways are sectioned off with rusted fencing, and safe areas are now filled with monsters. This, in my mind, acts as a way to include Resident Evil's world-famous backtracking, but changing the environment so much that it doesn't feel like retreading the same ground over and over again. This has the added bonus of doubling the amount of time you spend in any one area, but also having the time you feel like you've been in that same environment. Or at least it did for me. It also ramps up the difficulty just when you might have cleared out every hostile in the area. Kinda like a refresh when exploration has hit a dead end and things start to drag. And I think that serves as a perfect time to talk about getting around in this game. Even though the genre staple tank controls are present and accounted for here, Harry does not move like a STARS member. He can be pretty hard to control during a sprint, and changing directions on the fly will have you come into a halt so that he can reorient. Overall, I'd say it's not as satisfying to control as your typical Resident Evil game, but the incredibly smooth animations are really damn nice, and you will get used to accounting for them after a bit. But no matter how fast you are, you can't completely outrun every fight, so how does the combat fare? Well, hitting a shoulder button still readies a weapon, and it's still a good idea to run away from any encounter that's not heavily in your favor. But there's a lot more at play here than any self-respecting RE fan might be used to. First off is the crazy detailed animations I mentioned before. Not only do these smoothly communicate what's going on, but they also play heavily into a fight. There are a lot of frames after hitting that R2 button where you're not going to be able to do much of anything. You have to correctly gauge when to pop a shot off because bringing up your weapon is nowhere near instantaneous, and the same goes for the game's much larger emphasis on melee combat. Each of the many weapons to be found controls wildly different from the last, and the addition of a charged heavy attack is a nice little touch. Some weapons will allow you to fight and move at the same time, a mechanic that blew my mind at the time, and there's also a stray function mapped to L and R1 that I honestly never used that much. And it's here that I need to dispel a bit of a rumor, one that even I used to be guilty of spreading. Despite what you've heard from many game review intellectuals, tank controls and hard to adapt to combat is not some kind of purposeful choice made by the devs to further increase the game's horror. I mean, sure, it definitely has that side effect, but to be blunt, this was just the only way we knew of that would move a character around in games with such wildly changing camera angles. Tank controls and their accompanying combat were just staples of the genre at the time, and in this industry that had just gotten the hang of gaming in all three dimensions, it would be a while till we figured out other ways to tackle this. Now, if you ask me, these controls feel just as natural as walking in real life and are actually really easy to adapt to. But it's always bothered me when people try so hard just to justify every little aspect of the genre. Tank controls and hard combat are just something that was in the games at the time, and there's no real deeper meaning to them. But let's get down to the real controversy. Most of you that have argued with me in my comments section are probably already typing out several long paragraphs by now, so we might as well address it. I do still believe a fixed camera or fixed perspective is necessary to the genre, and Silent Hill does allow you to move the camera to a small degree. And here's where I have to hang my head and accept that I was wrong. Or at least I would have to if Team Silent hadn't already defined this as psychological horror, making sure my fragile ego remains unmolested. So take that. But in all seriousness, I do think this game fits in with my very specific definition of the genre. Sure, you can swing the camera to your back at any time, but this is a very lengthy affair, making it much harder to survey your environment than it is in any third or first-person games falsely claiming the survival horror title. For the majority of the game, the camera does move, but it typically stays in a locked angle or track, and if you ask me, it's just a bit more reliable to keep it there, making use of audio cues to get an idea for what might be waiting for you around any given corner. And just as a little tip, if you are bad with motion sickness, I would not move that camera very often because it is very disorienting. And let's be honest here, Silent Hill uses a myriad of effects to achieve the same results as fixed camera angles. There's the dynamic lighting, darkness, and fog, obscuring enemies and your environment, so I think we're pretty safe in the survival horror definition here. As far as core difficulty goes, I'd say it's kind of hard to sum up. Evading attacks in Silent Hill is much harder than its Raccoon City counterpart, thanks to Harry needing time to transition from running to walking. Adding to that frustration, sometimes hitting a diagonal direction will count as letting go of the other directions, and you'll find yourself stumbling to a walking pace, giving the faceless beast you are trying to avoid the perfect opportunity to line up an attack. But on the flip side of this, with a little bit of skill and some knowledge of the genre, it's pretty easy to stockpile enough ammo to make even the most hardened doomsday prepper blush. Now, I will admit I have a tendency to reset the game if I get caught in a crappy situation, but I'd wager even first-timers would have an easy time maintaining resources on normal difficulty. But those two elements are only really half the story. Of course, we can't have a survival horror game without puzzles, and I think this is where Silent Hill really comes into its own. The puzzles here vary to an insane degree and almost always require a lot of thought to complete. For this playthrough, I was in the lucky position of not remembering most of their solutions. I had to stop and scratch my head on more than one occasion, and if at all possible, I'd like to recommend you not looking up the solutions for these things online. Silent Hill puzzles mostly live in a very cool little middle ground between challenging and solvable, and I promise you will feel so satisfied when you finally figure one out. Plus, they're really well integrated into the story and its characters, so that makes a very cool added layer of immersion, which is always nice. Silent Hill is an amazing example of how incredible things can come from some pretty unexpected origins. Konami, just looking to copy Capcom's success with an over-the-top action Hollywood experience, ended up getting a very cool survival horror game that rivaled and even surpassed Resident Evil in a lot of ways. And I can't help but feel like some of the additions here might make it easier for new players to transition into the genre than they might have if they had just jumped into an old RE title. The puzzles will certainly satisfy those of you looking to get a bit of a mental workout while you're playing, and genre vets will love seeing all the innovations Team Silent were able to contribute. Now, you guys know what a huge shrieking fanboy I am for Resident Evil, but honestly, I don't think I could pick a favorite between these two if I had a gun to my head. But I can say this. Silent Hill is one of the most satisfying games I have ever played in my life. It took so many chances, and I honestly don't think we'll ever see another game with this much ingenuity and heart ever again. Do whatever you can in order to play this game. It truly is an example of all the good this medium can provide, and a solid contender for one of the most important video games ever made.
Are you okay?
And finally, we have arrived at one of the more publicized features of Silent Hill, its presentation. It's no secret that the PS1, while billed as a serious 3D gaming machine, didn't exactly have the pixel-pushing power to support big wide-open 3D environments, or at least not without some fancy workarounds, and Team Silent took advantage of just about every trick in the book to get SH running and looking its best. But before we talk about that, we have to ask why. If Konami was looking to compete with Resident Evil, why not copy the pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles common in those games? Well, at the time, 2D was getting harder and harder to sell to the public. Gamers wanted more 3D, and as far as major gaming publications went, it was the 3D titles that got billed for full-page spreads. I have to assume Konami made this a prerequisite when tasking Team Silent with an RE killer, so it makes sense this would carry into the final product. A final product that looks absolutely amazing on the surface, but becomes more and more impressive the more you learn about its design. As everyone likely already knows, the fog in Silent Hill was used to both mask texture pop-in and decrease the amount of visible game world that needed to be rendered. But the N64 had been using this type of trick for years. Why the hell does SH get all the credit? Well, these guys understood that their game needed to rely on its world and atmosphere to sell itself, and if that was the case, everything would need to be in service of those elements, even the graphical shortcuts. Silent Hill was made foggy by its limitations, but that fog was made real by Team Silent's creativity. They decided that the fog wasn't enough on its own, so they explained it in-game as being a result of the town's location right smack dab next to a huge lake, and then made that lake into the town's mythology by having it serve as the cause of Silent Hill's vacation destination status for a while. On top of this, the added layer of falling snow helped incorporate the fog into the overall cohesive look of the game. Now, there's no doubt that is a very interesting tidbit, but there's even more going on under the hood here. Like the game's video output, or more specifically, the fact that Silent Hill doesn't utilize the console's typical vertical resolution of 240p, instead going with a pillar boxed picture, probably to save some processing overhead. Now, I know those of you with a keen eye have probably noticed all of my footage here looks round about 960p, which is the normal integer scale for PS1 games, but there's a pretty interesting explanation for that. The PS3 I captured most of my footage on scales PS1 games up to a 1080p vertical output, and that stretching on the y-axis almost perfectly makes up the difference. On a PS1 running through the FrameMeister set to an even 3x scale, we're left with a pretty small amount of screen real estate. Now, I know most of you really don't care about this stuff, but man, it's really interesting seeing games that tweak the normal parameters of the PS1 that we're all used to. You've no doubt noticed the incredible amount of dithering present in the game, and it should come as no surprise that this was also a method used to cut back on the horsepower needed to run the game well. See, in some retro consoles like the Genesis and Saturn, dithering was a very necessary step taken to mitigate a very low amount of colors available at once, and a low overall color depth, and depending on your sensibilities, you'll either love the dithered look or hate it. As far as I go, well, I actually really like it. I know a lot of people like to argue that dithered patterns weren't meant to be seen since the garbage quality of composite video was supposed to blend these colors together, but to me, being able to see the dithered nature of these games acts as a sort of lifting of the veil. When I started upscaling games, the dithered pattern acted as a sign that I had removed all of the layers of hidden quality from my screen and was finally seeing my games at their purest intended level of presentation. But to be completely honest, I could understand if you don't like this much being visible on screen at all times. Oddly enough, in Silent Hill's case, the dithering wasn't a fault of the console. I mean, the PS1 could fill your screen with a boatload of colors theoretically, but in a fully 3D world, every possible pixel counted, and dithering was a nice way of displaying relatively smooth color gradients while leaving every other pixel in a given area essentially unrendered. All of these workarounds managed to make SH look and run incredibly well, but it was not a cure-all. The game seems to run below 30 frames per second most of the time, and including a lot of 3D assets in the screen, we'll see the frame rate drop noticeably. Now, typically I would make some kind of excuse here because, well, nepotism, but I've railed on other games for the same thing, so for consistency's sake, this can get annoying when it mixes with Harry's awkward controls and tendency to stop running when he's hit a wall. But hey, sidestepping performance issues isn't the only element at play here. The overall level of quality on display here is surprisingly great looking, artistically speaking. Animations for running, taking damage, and character interactions all look incredibly smooth and seem to have been motion captured. Of course, this can look off in some scenes.
Hold it!
But overall, I'd say this is a win. 3D models are insanely detailed across the board, and textures look very believable even up close. Of course, you can't get away with not mentioning how creepy the monster design is, and it most definitely is, but I'm more interested in the more peripheral elements. The design of Silent Hill exists in some kind of theoretical master level, and it's not due to any one reason. And once again, this is because the game's artistic vision matches up perfectly with its world building. The game does a lot with its story and voice acting to give you the feeling that things are just off here, and the artwork on display furthers this immensely. The biggest and most visible example are the gory decorations and, well, let's face it, sacrifices on display in some parts of the environment. These hanging bodies aren't scary on their own, especially to a modern gamer who's able to see people being ripped apart in full 4K glory, but they are very off-putting. And for a while, I didn't understand why I found them to be so effective. I mean, point at any one game in the PS1 era and you would find dead bodies somewhere in there, but they never really affected me the way Silent Hills do. But then I noticed a trend. None of these bodies have faces. You know, that thing that we humans use to identify each other? Well, that's no longer present, and I don't mean their faces have been ripped off. I mean they're just not there. Faces are always obscured in such a way that there's no evidence there ever was one, and that really messes with the part of my brain that tries to understand everything I see. You'll also notice proportions aren't exactly correct either. Another little trick done to make sure you immediately understand the outline of what you're looking at, but on closer inspection, you start to understand less and less about it. This approach to design permeates nearly every area in the game, especially the otherworld. Honestly, I wish there was some type of psychological study I could point to explain why I find these things so intrinsically scary, but I really have no explanation here. They just are in my mind. And if there was one real complaint I had with the game's presentation, it's that picking up items can sort of break that immersion factor a bit. Now don't get me wrong, teenage me loves seeing these detailed 3D objects spinning on screen, but so much is done to keep the game's elements off screen, it just seems to clash with the minimalist look that Team Silent pulled off, keeping health displays and map items sectioned away from the in-game world. But even I can admit this is a small gripe at worst. And at this point you might be wondering, hey Jared, don't you always cover the ports in these videos? What about the ports? Well, there are none, so shut up.
Wait, I just remembered something.
Well, okay, so I guess there is a visual novel type of game released on the Game Boy Advance in Japan, but it's just a retelling of the original's events. I haven't played much of it myself since any translations are only playable via a web browser, and you know how I am with actual hardware. But the music is kind of interesting, and the sprite art shows some angles of areas never seen before, so I guess if you're into that kind of thing, you'll be into this kind of thing. Silent Hill, with its intricately modeled 3D world and super sharp 2D elements, is the perfect game to run through the FrameMeister, as I have always been a huge, unapologetic fan of early PS1 3D. But sadly, this is damn near unplayable on most upscalers for a very dumb but very understandable reason. Team Silent was looking for a sharper look for the game's inventory and map screens, so they're presented in 480i instead of the console's standard 240p. And it definitely makes for a nicer looking interface, but the quick switching between resolutions tends to trip up most retro video upscalers as they struggle to keep up with the changes. This means a long wait between moving in and out of these screens, and since you're going to want to check your map a lot, you'll be leaving yourself open to Silent Hill's monsters as you wait to get a picture back on your screen. And while it may suck admitting my FrameMeister can't solve all of my problems, yet, there are still readily accessible methods to get a very good looking picture from Silent Hill. Your typical household PS3 will actually upscale PS1 games, and I have to say, it looks pretty damn impressive all things considered. All of the footage you've been looking at today was recorded on a slim model PS3, and even though it's technically emulation, I think most people will be perfectly satisfied with it. There's a visible amount of sharpness lost on the PS3 when comparing the two, and the aspect ratio does seem to be maybe a bit wider than on official hardware, but given the alternative, I don't think anyone would complain. Well, except for me, but that's because I'm unpleasable. And lastly, we have to talk about what might be the most important element in the game, bar none. After the original composer left the project, a young Akira Yamaoka requested the job and actually created most of the game's sound, including sound effects. He created the game's soundtrack in a pretty unconventional method, not by watching footage of the game being played, but from the concept art. He saw the rusted metal with the cold environments and wanted a sound that was equally abrasive. He ended up taking inspiration from industrial music and, well, industrial sounds, and included a lot of harsh, clangy, metallic noises mixed with other very unsettling motifs. That being said, he wasn't afraid to keep music out of the areas where ambient environmental noises would be way more appropriate. Yamaoka would continue a similar approach to music as the series went on, and it's interesting to go back to his first time dabbling with this sound. As he perfected his style, he would use more electronic drums and twangy sounding kind of surf riffs. But this original offering is much colder and aggressive than anything he's ever made. If you ever found any of the man's musical work as impressive as I have, you definitely want to get a hold of this soundtrack. Just don't go to sleep listening to it. I'm pretty sure that's a guaranteed way to lose your mind. All things considered, we owe Silent Hill a huge debt of gratitude. Sure, there may have been games that dealt with dark psychological subject matter in the past, oddly enough mostly in the PC space, but Team Silent beat all the odds and brought their own special brand of serious horror to the masses and picked up real steam in its day. The game sold well enough to greenlight a sequel, and if you ask me, that's a pretty amazing feat. It's hard to imagine a similar situation happening today in the AAA gaming market. So don't waste this gift from the gods, no matter how you do it. Real hardware, PlayStation Network, hell, emulate the damn thing on your 2006 Toshiba laptop. Just make sure you play it. If it wasn't obvious by now, Silent Hill means a lot to me. It showed me that games could mess with the way that I think and the way I see the world around me. They could affect me in ways I never thought possible. And yeah, the controls can take a while to get used to, and maybe PS1 era graphics won't be everyone's bag, but that absolutely will not stop me from saying this is one of the most important games to ever grace the medium. And if you're having trouble believing me, even after all this, do yourself a favor. Wait till it's dark out, put on a pair of headphones, and prepare to enter a terrifying world you won't likely ever want to leave. Thank you all for joining me in this offering to Samael, and make sure to stick around, because in 2 weeks we're coming right back to this weird little town. Only things aren't quite like we remember them. But until then, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Thank you very much for watching the Silent Hill Retrospective. Well guys, it looks like we found ourselves back in that empty little vacation town, but for some reason it doesn't feel like the same Silent Hill we came to know in our last visit. After Konami tasted a bit of success with their psychological horror underdog, the green light for a sequel was so bright you could see it from low orbit. And with an inflated budget and a larger staff, comes some pretty natural worries. Like, is this going to be a cash-in, a shadow of its former self masquerading as an indie horror title? Plus, there's the obvious question, like, how the hell could you continue from Silent Hill 1's satisfying ending? What's left to cover? And most importantly, will delving deeper into this world risk destroying the vague, unknown charm that it had in the first place? Well, I think it's about time we did some digging, so if you'll join me, let's take a little trip. We'll take the exit just past Brahms and return to that ghost town you just can't get out of your head. What's up guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to Silent Hill. Silent Hill 2 started development almost right as the first game started to pick up steam, only instead of blessing my beloved PS1, it would serve as free marketing for the upcoming PlayStation 2. Now at the time I remember a lot of buzz going around, with games media obsessing over release snippets of CG cutscenes and detailed 3D renders from Sony's new offering. And speaking from personal experience, we Silent Hill fans were suffering from dangerous levels of hype for this release. And speaking of expectations, this is probably going to be another long one, so head down to the description below for a table of contents with timestamps to all the stuff we're going to go over today. I get that 30 or 40 minutes is a long time to be sitting on YouTube, so I figured I'd give you guys a little more access to the video's contents without having to sit through 10 minutes of an old guy yelling about how no one truly understands survival horror anymore. Like I said before, we were all overflowing with excitement for this bad boy to finally drop, but there was one little seed of doubt slowly starting to root in my mind. After being glued to my ViewSonic CRT monitor for any and all possible SH2 media, I started to notice a trend. I didn't recognize any of these people. How were they going to follow up a beloved game like Silent Hill 1 without even having a returning cast member? From the very start, Silent Hill 2's story was gonna differ a bit from the first, as Keiichiro Toyama would not be returning to pen this script. Instead, Team Silent vet Hiroyuki Iwaku stepped up to the plate and started on a story oddly enough dreamed up by CGI director Takeyoshi Sato. Being heavily inspired by Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Iwaku introduced a completely new spin-off approach to the game's story. Instead of picking up right where we left off with the first game, Part 2 would delve into wholly unrelated events that could possibly happen at any point in the SH timeline. While this approach is still a very contentious one, I appreciate the balls it took to completely flip the script on what was a proven formula. But before we get too far in, we should probably sum things up here. The story of Silent Hill 2 starts with a new face, James Sunderland, a guy following a letter from his wife telling him that she would meet him in their special place in the vacation town Silent Hill. The game gets its start with James on the outskirts of the foggy ghost town in a highway rest area looking into a mirror and seemingly questioning his own sanity. Now, why would he be doing that? Well, that letter from his wife has some pretty damning implications, seeing as how she's been dead for quite some time.
Anyway, she's dead. I don't know why I think she's here.
And if you ask me, this was probably the most Silent Hill way these guys could have started this game. A1, 10 out of 10, super cool start. So we've got ourselves a record-breaking home run of an opening. Does the rest of the story keep up that momentum? Well, on his journey to figure out just what the hell is going on here, James comes across 3 other characters that seem to be on a similar journey. 2 of these guys are coming to Silent Hill to find something, much like James, and the other is a little girl who knew James's late wife. Sadly, in very SH fashion, these characters speak very cryptically and rarely give out any concrete information. And for me, this was a welcome return, as part of what made the original so creepy was the fact that there was no readily available answers to be found, and anyone trying to explain things to you often left you with more questions than answers.
You don't have to lie. Go ahead and say it. Or you could just force me. Beat me up like he always did.
Angela, Eddie, and Laura give off a very similar vibe here, acting as visual and auditory signs that things aren't quite right in the old town of Silent Hill. Both Angela and Eddie are very clearly messed up in the head, and neither's going to be holding a long, coherent conversation. And Laura, well, she's just a kid. There's not much she'd be able to tell you anyways, even if she wasn't an absolute brat to you most of the time. God, I hate Laura.
Ow! Hey, wait! Damn it.
And here's where things get a little deeper than surface level, so if you haven't experienced this story for yourself, I highly recommend you skip to the time code on screen to avoid any dead serious spoilers. I know this is an old game, but part of the purpose behind these videos is to make sure people who haven't played Silent Hill are given near constant reminders that they should remedy that. So now that it's just us veterans here, let's talk about what's actually going on. Like I said before, Silent Hill 2 is essentially an expansion on the concept introduced in Crime and Punishment. James, Eddie, and Angela have all done something terrible, and whether or not you think these were horrible crimes, our characters definitely do. In this game, instead of showing the further corruption of Silent Hill's spiritual power thanks to a certain demon-worshipping cult, we're left with the after effects of it. These lost souls were called to Silent Hill to either come to grips with or atone for their acts, and as the game goes on, it becomes very clear that call didn't exactly come from the town itself. These people are all suffering from some kind of level of guilt, and a part of their inner psyche desperately needs them to admit their transgressions. And this leads to something series vets are very used to at this point: common misconceptions. A shallow analysis of SH2 will have the player assume that the town of Silent Hill, through some unknown process, is punishing these people for the things that they've done. And it can be easy to come to this conclusion, but the actual events follow SH1 a little closer than you might have thought. Like we covered in the first video of the retrospective, the town of Silent Hill doesn't necessarily do anything. It's the people in the town that cause manifestations of their own personal hells. To put it bluntly, the town will make real the most dark and hidden aspects of your unconscious mind. For James, this means creating a punishment made by him for him. Meaning, yes, all of the game's monsters come from his inner fears and emotions, which explains their, let's say, interesting look. To be honest, there's a lot of analysis into why certain enemies look the way they do, kind of like how the bubblehead nurses seem to have their sexiness on full display but are lacking a visible face. But to be honest, I think people tend to get too far into the weeds with trying to psychoanalyze every aspect of this game, and I feel like that really takes away from experiencing it as the mystery it's supposed to be.
How do you know that?
Sure, I definitely understand why people do this, and I don't begrudge them for it, but the unconfirmed reasoning that's in my, and likely your head, is always going to be more terrifying than what I could deliver in a YouTube video. I mean, Team Silent really wanted these games to affect you on an unconscious level, and maybe we should leave it at that. Or at least I will. As you all probably know by now, throughout the game James is chased by this red pyramid thing, but That's not the only manifestation James is responsible for, and honestly, the least interesting one. He eventually comes across what appears to be his late wife Mary's doppelganger. Maria looks nearly identical to Mary, save for more sexy fashion sense and a very clingy, affectionate personality, which drives a lot of assumptions here. If Maria was created by James's unconscious desires, it's easy to assume these are traits that he saw as the ideal Mary. And going one step further, you can assume certain things about the monsters that he's populated the town with. Each of these creatures share a very common theme, from high-heeled shoes to buxom bosoms and, well, the obvious. It's clear that James has some sexual frustrations, and I think that's pretty understandable. If Mary was suffering from a terminal disease, I doubt they were knocking boots that often, and he seems incredibly torn up after her death, so it stands to reason he hasn't jumped back into the dating scene just yet. And, well, I guess it's about time we talked about it. Near the end of the game, James finally comes to the realization that Mary didn't exactly succumb to her illness. No, she died at James's own hands. It seems Mary was stuck in a hellish existence of pain and suffering, and, well, she just wanted it to end. This revelation makes for a very interesting aha moment. The game never really needs to tell you out loud that Pyramid Head serves as a physical representation of James's inner guilt, animosity, and general distaste for himself. It just seems obvious given the context. And the moments where James is forced to watch Maria die are clearly him reliving his most traumatic moment. Now maybe he feels like he deserves to constantly be reminded of his own actions, or maybe they were so scarring that he can't help but relive them. But either way, we're able to form our own general explanations, and there's no real need for any one conclusion to be supported. After all, we're dealing with highly volatile mental issues here, and oftentimes there's no clearly defined line that denotes exactly why we feel the way we do. So it's nice that the game's take on the matter is equally, shall we say, murky. In this way, I think Silent Hill 2 is one of the most interesting delves into mental illness we've ever seen here in the gaming sphere. But on that same note, I think it leads to my biggest gripe with the game. For a lot of fans of the game, this isn't just their favorite Silent Hill game, it's the Silent Hill game, and for the life of me, I just can't understand that reasoning. Now, I should probably qualify that. By no means am I saying this is not an incredible story, because it most certainly is. By all means, this game's worthy of all the praise you can physically give it, but in the end, it's a spin-off. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but Uber SH2 fans tend to use this game specifically to discredit the rest of the series, even though they all have a sort of symbiotic relationship to each other. Here, think of it this way. Would the events of Silent Hill 2 have made any rational sense to you if you weren't already aware that the titular town possessed a supernatural power to bring inner thoughts into the physical world? Of course not, and then the game would have had to sacrifice its concise story to allow for unneeded world building. So I know I still haven't adequately explained why this bothers me. I mean, who cares what Silent Hill fans think? I can just think whatever I want. Well, the fans aren't the issue here. The real issue is SH2's admittedly incredible story has served as the one and only archetype for a Silent Hill story since Team Silent's disbanding. Now, I don't want to go too far in depth since I still haven't decided whether or not I want to cover the non-Team Silent produced games in this series, but ever since Konami started hiring outside help to make SH games, the theme of main character did something or experienced something horrible and must go to Silent Hill to remember, /make peace with, /get over, /atone for it, has been present in every single entry without exception. And it seems incredibly odd that so many different developers from so many different walks of life would look at such a radical departure from the other 3 games in the series and think to themselves, this seems like a one-off experience and perfectly encapsulates how future games in the series should be made. I mean, hell, the law of averages alone suggests that we should have at least seen a non-SH2 clone Silent Hill game merely by random chance at this point, but that is definitely not the world we're living in. And yeah, I know I'm harping on about this, but there's just something about faux intellectuals jumping on a bandwagon to further their own god complexes that really pisses me off. And yes, that does mean I absolutely cannot stand 95% of the games industry, including what should be my peers in games media. I guess if I had to liken it to something, it would be like when a song gets overplayed and that makes you more likely to overanalyze and criticize it. Look, like I said before, I think this is an amazingly dark, well-written, emotionally effective, and downright skillfully executed story. I can't even describe to you my own mental state as I sat there on my bed in the dark on a warm Miami night, finishing the game for the first time.
James, you made me happy.
It was truly something everyone should experience, but maybe the admiration for Silent Hill 2 has reached Earthbound levels, where a large portion of the fan base is made up of people who haven't really played the game but enjoy its aesthetic or what it says about them and their incredibly avant-garde tastes. Regardless of my fanboy whining though, I hope I was able to get the point across. Silent Hill 2 has one of the most introspective and thought-provoking stories I have ever played. It's a dark and accurate look at the effects of guilt, and even though I'm leaving out a lot of elements in the interest of keeping this video under an hour, trust me when I say you don't know yourself until you've truly sunk into this world. So maybe it's about time you've dusted off that PS2 and introduced yourself to one of the best examples of video game storytelling that we have. Team Silent seemed to be real big fans of the if it ain't broke, don't fix it school of game design. They found a gameplay style that they liked and that fit the world they had built, so they brought an improved version of that same style over to this new entry. And I know that sounds like it should be mundane or at the very least expected, but hey, think of it this way. Of your favorite PS1 series, how many of them have made the jump to the next generation of hardware without suffering any significant subtractions from their gameplay styles? I'm gonna assume that number is relatively close to zero, and hell, that's not exactly a given today, so this stands as one of the reasons fans were so attached to this relatively small group within Konami. It was clear Team Silent had a vision, and they were completely unwilling to compromise on seeing that vision come to fruition. Of course, I can't expect everyone to have already played a Silent Hill game, and even if they had, there's a chance it wasn't the right Silent Hill game. No, don't you worry, we'll crack that little chestnut a little further down the road. Anyways, the point is, a little more of an explanation might be necessary here. Silent Hill 2 sticks incredibly close to the survival horror conventions put in place by genre headrunner Resident Evil. Tank controls are used here for movement, meaning up will always move your character forward relative to their orientation, and left and right will spin James on his axis. Again, R1 and L1 can be used to strafe, and again, I just never used this in any meaningful way during these 3 playthroughs. Just like the first game, James's movement is a lot more affected by momentum than your typical STARS member, meaning you won't be stopping on a dime or going from walking to running without a bit of wind up in between. This can be pretty hard to get used to if you, say, hypothetically, just spent 2 years covering all the Resident Evil games and got pretty used to transitioning into a run with almost no startup frames. I will say this approach does make it hard to maneuver like a boss, but it does feel, I guess organic is the best word for it. It just kind of feels like how an actual person would move. And as a bit of good news, the looser controls do not have a negative impact on another survival horror staple, running from fights. While playing this game on every platform it's available for, I had no problem steering clear of enemies in both the wide open and smaller interior locations. So even though this control style may be rough to get used to, once you do, you'll find it's just as responsive as any other games in the genre. I will say though, I found that just like SH1, Part 2's normal mode gave me enough ammo to make sure I didn't really need to run from every monster I encountered. Even towards the late game, I was dodging enemies more as a habit than a necessity. Hell, I finished the game with a bullet count in the hundreds and enough healing items to start my own pharmacy, so if you're a vet of the genre, you might want to set the action difficulty to hard. Speaking of action, the combat is yet another unchanged element from the first game. Holding R2 will ready your weapon, and the action button still can be pressed for one type of attack and held for another. Although this time around I noticed I wasn't as loaded down with melee options as I was in Part 1. In the first game, the first 2 or so hours had me a good 3 melee weapons to choose from, but for most of Silent Hill 2 you'll be stuck with the starting plank of wood with nails in it. Which really isn't a problem since, like I said, you'll have enough ammo to start a revolution in South America by the time you're finished, but replays on hard will definitely leave you wishing you had at least 2 more options. And since we're comparing and contrasting to the first game, Part 2 definitely spends a lot less time having you explore the town of Silent Hill. One of my favorite aspects of SH1 was running around town finding hidden little alleys and burger joints filled with healing items, and you still do this in 2 but to a noticeably lesser degree. Also absent are the abrupt and violent transitions to the game's other world. The first outing had an air raid siren signaling Harry crossing over into Alessa's nightmare made real, but 2 is operating under slightly different circumstances than the original, so things are naturally just a little bit altered. Instead of being thrust into the other world at set moments, James slowly descends into his nightmare, a little piece of symbolism meant to signify him diving deeper into his inner torment. And I have to say, even though I really like this idea thematically, you do start to notice its absence after spending a lot of time in any one place. In Silent Hill, the shifts to the other world serve to break up long stretches of the player being in one location. The switch of scenery may have only been skin deep, but it really worked at keeping me from feeling fatigued. SH2 spends roughly the same amount of time in these areas, but the lack of any otherworld shift had me kind of getting tired of my location towards the tail end of me being there. Like I said before, the imagery of Silent Hill slowly becoming a nightmare with impossible architecture and crumbling structures works really well and is a really good way to tie the game's psychological tinge into its gameplay, but I wish there were a happy medium between the two approaches, maybe including more numerous interior areas but having them only last half as long. Of course, this is a pretty small nitpick, and first-time players will probably be so caught up in the game's atmosphere that this kind of stuff won't jump out at them, but having to play the game's many versions back-to-back kind of made little flaws like this more visible.
Leave her alone! Leave us both the hell alone!
Silent Hill 2's puzzles are just as challenging as the original and stay in that really cool middle ground of not being so easy that I sped through them with no thought, but difficult enough to keep me stumped for a bit. For this playthrough, I didn't have to look up any solutions, and just like before, I highly suggest you do the same. Getting stuck on a puzzle for a few minutes may seem like a bummer at first, but give it a little bit. The feeling of overcoming one of these head scratchers is one of the best parts of playing these games. But if you're a returning fan, there's always the added puzzle difficulties, and I won't lie, I've never had the balls for a hard puzzle run, but I imagine this will entice the masochists in the audience. Silent Hill 2 represents something we just don't see enough of nowadays. A sequel to a fan favorite that's not only brave enough to change up the established story and characters, but also smart enough to only improve on the gameplay. Nothing has been omitted here or changed so much that it doesn't feel like Silent Hill. You really got to give it up to these guys because Team Silent knew exactly what worked for their game and they knew exactly what needed to be tweaked for a sequel. Speaking honestly, this might be my favorite game in the series if not for these guys pulling the same exact move in the game's sequel, Silent Hill 3. The strict adherence to survival horror gameplay makes it easy for RE fans to just slip right in, and even opponents of the genre may still want to brave the challenges just to experience the game's world and deeply touching story. All in all, you really don't get much better than this. Silent Hill 2 is a classic for a very, very good reason. It represents an approach to game design centered around creating something because you desperately want to, not for any financial reasons. If you've made it this far through the video, it should be clear by now, I want you to play this game. So come jump into the world of Silent Hill and James Sunderland's twisted mind. I promise it is a trip you won't soon forget.
You! It was you, wasn't it? You're the one who stepped on my hand.
I don't know. Maybe I did.
The development of Silent Hill 2 was special in a lot of ways. Not only was Konami pouring funds into what used to be a very small team's project, but a new console generation was right around the corner, and I don't doubt many a PS2 owner owe their purchase to seeing these amazing looking CG cutscenes.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry. I
No,
was
it's
just...
okay. I didn't mean to...
It was clear Team Silent were making sure this game would look its absolute best, and at the time it was pretty surreal seeing a series that used to serve more as a budget title on the PS1 now being used to push units on the PS2. And if you ask me, I think the PS2 is key to all of this. In drilling into the console and draining every possible drop of theoretical performance out of it, Team Silent discovered tricks that just flat out couldn't be done on competing platforms, at least not in the same way. A subject we will most certainly touch on in the port section coming up. But aside from the PS2 specific stuff, SH2 is a marvel to look at. Specifically because lighting was given an incredible amount of attention, and since the first part of the game is spent exploring an apartment complex with no flashlight, you'll really start to get a feel for this fact. But once said flashlight is in your possession, well, the whole damn game changes. Team Silent really wanted this one little implement to sell the world that they were building, and man does it show. Not only does this cast a very convincing per vertex cone of real-time lighting, but it also casts perspective correct shadows, something I honestly can't remember being in any other PS2 game, well, aside from Silent Hill 3. Thanks to the added horsepower of the console, the game's monsters all look amazing in their uniquely haunting designs, allowing Masahiro Ito's illustrations to appear nearly unaltered in the transition into the game. But to your average passing eye, all of this pales in comparison to what really drove those PS2 sales, and that was the game's stunning, full 60 frame per second CG cutscenes. These cinematics are what originally caught my eye on Tech TV's extended play, and even though I had no idea what FPS were at the time, I could tell that these scenes were playing out in a much smoother manner than I was used to. In fact, my first playthrough of the game had me finding these CGs a little distracting. Most games I was used to at the time had a pretty low frame rate in their pre-rendered cutscenes, and thanks to this it was easy to find a focal point and keep centered on that the whole time. But SH2's incredibly smooth and fluid motion had my eyes constantly darting across the screen trying to keep track of it. Even today, my wife has an issue watching these and not commenting on how they look like something out of a soap opera. But if you appreciate large strides made in presentation, you'll likely find these scenes as entrancing as I do. One thing that really got me going was Team Silent's radical move not to give us the other world straight away. Like I mentioned before, James slowly descends into the depths of his own mind, and the town around him reflects that journey. But it's a much slower process than we diehard fans were used to. In the previous game, there was a shrieking air raid siren and boom, we were surrounded by chain link fencing and dead bodies. But Silent Hill 2 takes nearly the entire game to get to this level of desolated beauty. I really like this approach. It was like Team Silent were all teasing me, and by the time I came to realize it, I was already in the other world. It's one of those things you're likely to miss your first time around because there's so much to take in, but a second or third playthrough will have you noticing all the little things that were going on in the background. Now, of course, I can't talk about graphics without mentioning how great it is seeing classic Silent Hill landmarks in this brand new engine. The town is every bit of dreary and captivating as it was in the first game, only with a flashy new coat of paint over everything. I will reiterate that I wish I could spend as much time exploring the town proper as I did in Part 1, but the new interior areas are nothing to sneeze at. The first area you come across, the Woodside Apartments, are a tour de force of amazingly detailed graphical achievements. The lighting is perfectly dark and there are all kinds of little accent lights and colors that help make the environment pop. The game also makes sure that textures and tile sets are complicated enough that you'll never see them repeating a pattern, which is something designers struggle with even today. But if you ask me, all the cool stuff's going on under the hood. For example, for some reason the game displays its picture off-center, giving a big empty black space above the screen, which is a really odd decision. I mean, why not just include pillar boxing on the top and bottom that equals the same amount of real estate? That's what I ended up doing for the on-screen footage in this video, and I can't imagine it would have been that hard to implement. Real quick, I'll switch to my untouched capture footage so you can see how distracting this was for me. And before you say it, I don't think this was due to my FrameMeister or PS2. I used this exact same setup and settings to record footage for all my PS2 reviews, and I've never run into this issue. And as an added bonus, I found that using the game's included alignment option can really mess with the picture even more, so I opted to record my gameplay as is and fix it for you guys in post. As for its purpose, well, I imagine just like in Part 1, it was a decision made to save on processing power, but to be honest, I can't find any info on the subject, so feel free to leave a comment if you've cracked this little chestnut. And without a doubt, no discussion about SH2 is complete without mentioning the upgrades made to the fog. In the first game, fog served to obscure your view of Silent Hill, so the PS1 didn't catch fire trying to rendering that much real estate. And obviously it's still a huge part of the game's look, but in Part 2, it's used as more of a mask to enhance other tricks. This convincing effect is pulled off by using both 2D and 3D assets in unison with differing levels of alpha transparencies, which would be another one of those graphical tricks that proved incredibly difficult to replicate on other platforms. But I can't praise the game all day. Maybe it's because the first entry was a PS1 title and kind of deserves a little bit of leeway, or maybe it's because Part 2 is the darling of the series as far as most fans are concerned. But either way, there are aspects of SH2's presentation that bother the hell out of me. And first up on that list is the static overlay. Listen, I know all Silent Hill fans are supposed to worship this effect, but to my eyes it's a very low-res and unflattering implementation. Now, I imagine the blurriness of consumer CRTs and a set of composite cables might make for a more believable look, but sadly, that's just not an option for me. I know the devs use this overlay to keep the game from appearing too clean visually, but in my opinion, it just takes away from how sharp and impressive the game could have looked otherwise. And if you ask me, honestly, it's kind of lazy looking. Alright, now I know criticizing Team Silent's graphical choices is a pretty dick move at this point, but hear me out. Not only is this static look applied to the visible picture, but it even appears over the pillar boxing in cutscenes, which just feels terrible for some reason to me. Speaking of which, some cutscenes include close-up shots that really give you a look at how crystal clear the picture could have been and how sharp the pixels are. But there is a silver lining here. After you finish the game, you're given the option to disable this effect, something I definitely would recommend for your second playthrough. To be honest, this isn't exactly a huge gripe, but thanks to the overall excellence of the rest of the package, small issues like this can seem more noticeable. And speaking of small issues, I gotta say, the mouths look a little over-animated here. But okay, I might be going a little too far. Like I said, these are very small problems, and to be honest, they don't go anywhere near spoiling this incredible looking game. The PS2 proved to be a rough environment for developers to work in during its heyday, but Team Silent managed to make this console purr for them. Sure, there have been better looking games released for the PS2 since, specifically Team Silent's own sequel, but at the time there were no games that pulled off such a convincing and realistic looking presentation. And so it came to be that a sequel to a low-budget horror title became the benchmark for console gaming graphics. Man, I love the early 2000s. Of course, SH2's level of success would not go unnoticed. Konami was quick to make their new bestseller available to a much larger audience, but that process would prove a bit harder than you might think.
All you care about is that dead wife of yours.
Just a few months after Silent Hill 2's release, Konami shot out a port on Microsoft's Xbox, and the results were, well, complicated. Right off the bat, the Big K saw fit to include a tiny bit of extra story in the spin-off chapter called Born from a Wish. This gives you a bit of insight into what Maria was doing up until she met up with James. There's also a new UFO ending included, but if you ask me, the most interesting developments are in the presentation department. The first and most noticeable change is the leap from 480i to 480p. This makes for a much clearer, more detailed picture overall, especially in the more complicated background elements. Also, the per vertex flashlight illumination from the PS2 has been upgraded to a full-on per pixel effect. This means no more visible triangular boundaries in your flashlight cone, which makes for a very polished look. One thing that was really interesting is the implementation of a quad-channel surround sound feature that sadly I'm not able to take advantage of since my classic gaming setup is stereo only. But I've heard this is actually a pretty cool way to experience the game, so try it out if you can. Answering my prayers, this port of the game allows for removing the static effect without having to beat the game first, and if you ask me, this is the best addition this port brings to the table. I know it's sacrilege, but come on, the texture and 3D work here is perfectly able to pull off a dirty, nasty look on its own. Trust me when I say there's no need to throw a sloppy-looking, low-res overlay on top of all this incredible work. But sadly, these are the only changes I can comfortably call improvements. Like I said earlier, the game used a lot of tricks to get the PS2 to produce some incredible-looking effects, and when it came time to move this engine over to a new platform, those tricks obviously would no longer work. At this point, the port team were forced to use more Microsoft-friendly DirectX methods to approximate the look of the original. Now, sometimes this resulted in a pretty accurate replacement, but most of the time, well, it didn't. For example, the game's fog, while still looking pretty good, is much less present and thick looking here on the Xbox. This was due to the PS2's screen fill rate being incredibly high for the time, meaning the Xbox would have to scale down the amount of transparency effects being displayed at one time. Now, this may not be a downgrade for you personally or even something you would even notice, but it is an inaccuracy nonetheless, and also kind of an interesting little difference. One of several such differences you're likely to notice in playing these two games back to back, but I will say this, there are a few very obvious and universally agreed upon downgrades to note. First up is the gorgeous 60 frame per second cutscenes having their frame rate cut in half in order to save room on the disc. If you're used to how fluid and off-putting these cinematics were in the original, well, you're likely to notice this change right off the bat. These cutscenes are what drove sales for the game in the first place, and I think going with sloppy BINC video compression and a lessened frame rate does the original a pretty great injustice. On that same subject of compression, technically the Xbox version stores sound effects and music in a lower quality state than the original, but to be honest, this wasn't something I was able to pinpoint during actual gameplay. But for me, the absolute worst problem were the random hitches and hangs that I experienced during gameplay. It seemed like they're not very frequent, and I can't for the life of me figure out why they're happening, but every once in a great while there would be a few frames worth of a skip, which really bothered me. Now, I know this sounds like it's a bad port, since I've essentially only listed the negatives, but that's because the rest of it is just Silent Hill 2. The differences can be noticeable, but they're taking place over the same great game you've come to know and love. I wouldn't necessarily say Restless Dreams is a bad way to experience SH2, but if you ask me, it should only be used as a way for series vets to experience the game in a different light. Even though it's mostly the same game, first-timers would do well to stick to the original PS2 release. But even if you can't or don't want to take that advice, the Xbox version, while inaccurate as hell, is still a great way to play Silent Hill 2. But there are some not so great ways to play it.
What the hell is it?
The original PC port of SH2 was marred with graphical glitches, poor sound emulation, and the same compression-heavy 30 frame per second cutscenes found in the Xbox version. I remember trying to play through this release with a buddy of mine and having constant crashes and dealing with whole areas where sound effects would stop altogether. Trust me, I was there at launch, and it was a nightmare. Now I know what you're probably thinking. For a crappy version of the game, the footage on screen sure looks nice as hell. Well, what we're currently looking at is the result of a group of fans putting in countless hours of work to get this port of the game somewhere near the original. The Silent Hill 2 Enhanced Edition is a still expanding mod which alters and improves nearly every aspect of the game you could think of. Support for higher resolutions is now available, and a widescreen mode has been added which required the team to go through and alter camera placement and scene geometry to make sure things that would normally be hidden off-screen don't appear in normal gameplay. And while I have to admit I've only played up to the end of the Woodside Apartments, I haven't noticed anywhere that they've missed. Originally, this version of the game used the compressed 30 frame per second cutscenes from the Xbox release, and they look just as choppy as you'd imagine. Luckily, you can download an FMV pack that includes the PS2 originals and all of their 60 frame per second glory. They've also went through and fixed any lighting issues that could be found, and trust me, there were a lot in the original PC release. Thankfully, there's also an option to disable the dumb-looking red cross that appeared on screen when you're low on health, and most interestingly, there's an option to remove the pillar boxing from cutscenes. At first, I wasn't sure how I felt about this. I mean, pillar boxing does seem to make for a more cinematic presentation, but without them, the game seemed more immersive, like there was less happening on screen to remind me I'm just playing a video game. And now that I've played around with this option for a bit, I gotta say, I actually love it. It's something I would love to see running on the PS2 original. And of course, you've probably noticed this version also lets you disable the static overlay. But if you want to play with it on, the team has included a static filter that comes closer to the PS2 original, which is great because the overly sharp filter that the PC used to use was really nasty looking and a little too opaque for my taste. One element for me that is a 100% improvement though is the deep inky black levels available in the PC version. Since I'm used to experiencing these black levels with a bit of analog noise in them, I was taken aback when I saw the dark, impenetrable boundaries outside of James's flashlight. If you ask me, the Enhanced Edition is an absolute must for anyone thinking about playing the PC port of SH2. But once again, this is a version that should strictly be for people already familiar with the original. Don't get me wrong, what the Enhanced Edition has accomplished here is nothing short of a miracle, but it's still not perfect, and by perfect, I mean accurate. I mean, think about it this way. Right now as we speak, there are modders hard at work at trying to get elements of this PC version to look as good as the PS2 original that was released nearly 2 decades ago. Man, that's insane. And like clockwork, every time I work on one of these scripts, a mammoth discovery is made for a game that's lied dormant for the last 2 decades. As I'm writing this very part, fans have just today discovered a prototype of Silent Hill 2 with a build date of July 1st, 2001. The disc contains most of the game's contents on it, but only lets you play up until the first Pyramid Head fight. I'm hoping people will have this bad boy cracked soon so we can see if there's any major differences between these assets and the final release. But until then, let's jump in with a little of our own analysis. And before we get into that, I do want to apologize for the use of footage from an emulator here. I snagged an ISO for this build and assumed I could ESR patch it and run it on my PS2 running FreeMcBoot, but nothing I tried seemed to get it working. But hey, a little emulation never hurt anybody, right? So let's dive in. The first thing I noticed right off the bat was the footsteps and animal sounds in the forest area weren't present. And the game's 2D text seemed to be a bit off and weirdly colored. James's flashlight seems to not only pass through him, but also the pillar boxing and cutscenes, and a good number of items are either not placed yet or in a different spot than you're used to. There's also now loading text when moving from one room to the next, and man am I glad they did away with that in the final release. For some reason the FMVs don't work in this version, but apparently this isn't an issue on real hardware. I noticed some things you could probably call glitches and other graphical anomalies, but that's the issue with playing on an emulator. Getting an idea for whether it's the prototype or emulator that's causing the problem can be next to impossible. I know I'm going to sound really negative here, but overall I'd say this is a pretty uninteresting prototype. I mean, it's really cool seeing a game I love in some other form, but I was hoping to see some real differences. Incomplete assets, different outfits, you know what I mean. In my opinion, superfans should probably give this one a try, but if you don't really want to, well, you're not exactly missing out on much. On the plus side, apparently there's an inaccessible part of the disc that has James running around Silent Hill and Pyramid Head chasing him, so I guess there's that. But definitely keep an eye out for any more revelations coming from data mining this release. And since we're talking versions, you know it's not an Avalanche Reviews retrospective without a little back-to-back action. Don't read into that. So let's compare every version of Silent Hill 2 available right now. Obviously, the Xbox and PC release overtake the PS2 original in clarity and overall resolution, but if you ask me, SH2 was made in such a custom manner that you can't really separate it from the console that spawned it. Now, I know that sounds like an elitist thing to say, but I swear in this one instance, I'm not just speaking from a misguided sense of nostalgia for my first experience with the game. This game is just too ingrained in the PS2's odd, weird, and kind of quirky hardware to really put it anywhere else. Sure, other platforms have solutions for real-time lighting or perspective correct shadows, but they just don't look the same as they do on PS2 because of the little tricks that had to be pulled to get them working. Anyone looking to go ahead with the Xbox or PC versions of the game will definitely have a great time, and might not even notice any problems. But if you do, if you just so happen to notice a little stutter here or maybe an odd angle there, you're always going to wonder if this is how the game is supposed to play or a result of the changes made during the porting process. For me, the PS2 version is 100% the way to go for your first playthrough, but there's no bad options here. There's only 100% accuracy or 90%. I really like the additions and changes made to the base game and the subsequent releases, but to really appreciate these things, I think you need to be very familiar with what spawned them. Well, obviously the choice is going to ultimately be up to you guys, but trust me when I say you're going to want this disc spinning in your PS2 as soon as possible.
What a terrible tragedy. What a gruesome end to such innocent lives.
And I know you didn't think we're going to finish this one out without talking about the absolute genius that is Akira Yamaoka's masterful sound design. While the first game was filled with harsh, metallic, or industrial soundscapes, this game leans much harder on a softer, more ambient sound. Like I said in my previous video, Yamaoka would eventually come to develop a very recognizable sound to his music, and this game is 100% the beginning of that process. Here we start to notice his love for including guitar tracks and his tendency to use a tinny sort of surf rock sound to his tuning and amp effects. The entire soundtrack has a much more somber, sad tone to it than SH1, and just like before, the man is not afraid to omit music altogether, letting his masterful environmental sound effects set the stage for one of the creepiest audio experiences you're likely to ever have. On a personal note, it's amazing playing these games back to back like this and being able to see his sound evolve to what I think is his ultimate level in the next game. But as far as video game soundtracks go, this is easily one of the best in existence. Yamaoka's tracks here straddle the line between dark hopelessness and ambient melodic beauty, and the overall sound design is no slouch either. Enemies sound incredibly scary, and little tones and jingles included all over for small actions will give you a very otherworldly feel. Kind of like this is all some kind of hazy dream. Without a doubt, this is a soundtrack you're gonna want to get your hands on. It truly is a work of absolute genius and one of the most immersive soundscapes in video games, period.
He was dead when I got here, honest. Anyway, I gotta run.
Hopefully I've made it painfully clear that Silent Hill 2 is a more than worthy follow-up to the original Foggy Town simulator. It takes everything you could have possibly liked about SH1 and amplifies it exponentially. The graphics, interface, music, and sound effects are all dramatically better, but still give off a very Silent Hill type of feeling. The fact that it elected to leave the core story of the series behind and instead focused on new characters and their inner torment was, in my opinion, a bold and awesomely rewarding idea. I mean, sure, I would have preferred a continuation of the town's story and how it entangled with the cult of the first game, but SH2 gave the writers a lot of freedom. They didn't have to worry about keeping up with continuity and just focused on telling a deeply disturbing tale that would resonate with the fans. And it's here that I have to admit a bias that those of you that know me are already aware of. Alright, here we go. I honestly feel like Silent Hill 2 is overrated, but wait, hold on, put down your pitchforks. Not in the way you might think. I could care less what fans think about the game because obviously that has no bearing on me, but it's game developers and games journalists that make this such an overhyped release. Essentially, everyone in a position to sell themselves as a creative person is damn near forced to consider this to be the gold standard of gaming, and at its core there's nothing wrong with that. That is, until it's time to create something. Like I said before, every single person to ever attempt a Silent Hill game after the disbanding of Team Silent did so under the impression that SH2 should serve as the mold that their art has to flow into. And if you're the kind of edgy dork who never grew out of the suicide is cool and meaningful mentality, then you're likely to trumpet this game's accomplishments from the rooftop, letting the Cheeto dust fall from your patchy beard like an elegant snow to the pavement. But all jokes aside, this isn't aimed at you, the hardcore Silent Hill 2 fan. I imagine you have your own reasons for preferring this entry over the others, and hell, more power to you. There's just some incredibly annoying people on your side of the fence. I mean, honestly, Silent Hill 2 is flat out amazing, which makes it hard to disagree with fair-weather fans who have only played 2, or even worse, have never played it but spend all their time consuming fan theories and dissertations about how Pyramid Head could totally exist outside of James's inner... Okay, look, I might be ranting a little bit. The point is, Silent Hill 2 is incredible. It's one of the best sequels ever made, and a frontrunner for the best example of how to weave a meaningful narrative into a plot without bogging the player down with pages of exposition. It really is something to behold, and even if you're the kind of person who prefers 2 over the better games in the series, I can totally see where you're coming from. I may not agree, but I'll be damned if you can't make a solid argument for your position. So if you've made it this far and still haven't put it together, I fully and wholeheartedly recommend you go out and play Silent Hill 2. Not only is it important to me, but I would say it's important to the industry. I think we would all be a lot better off if more people remembered how Team Silent made the perfect follow-up to a game that was already amazing. Once again, I want to suggest that newcomers start with the PS2 original, but they're all great options. Well, maybe not all of them. Yes, we are definitely going to talk about that soon, I promise. But until then, I want to thank you all for sticking with me for this long and for supporting this series. Stay tuned because next time we'll be catching up with a few familiar characters and possibly putting an end to the events that started in Part 1. I hope to see all of you again for that one, but if not, I want to thank you all for watching the Silent Hill Retrospective. Well guys, I know we just got done sorting that torrid business with James and all of his personal baggage out, but I think it's time we return to that empty vacation resort. I've been getting the feeling that we're not quite done with the events of our first trip, and I don't know about you guys, but if there's one thing I want after watching a man lose his daughter to a deranged demon-worshipping cult, it's closure. So pile in everyone, it's about time we put an end to this insanity once and for all. For those of you who've made this trip with me before, expect something a little different from what you remember, and for those stumbling across this town for the first time, well, welcome to Silent Hill. Back in the heyday of the PS2, Konami could be called a lot of things, but unwilling to capitalize on a successful franchise is definitely not one of them. After SH2 managed to capture an even bigger audience than the game that preceded it, we were certain a follow-up was on its way, but what we didn't know is that it would have a much smaller team than before, which could spell bad news, but in this situation was perfectly reassuring. That's because the main components of Team Silent present for parts 1 and 2 were on board for this sequel, and if there's one thing I want you guys to take away from this retrospective, it's that these guys know how to make a detail-rich and engaging video game. Oh, and before we get too deep into this, I'm sure this is going to turn into another lengthy trip, so check out the description where I'll be leaving a sort of table of contents with timestamps for all the juicy details. And with that out of the way, just like before, E3 and the gaming press at the time made sure we were assaulted on all sides with Silent Hill 3 media, and just like before, this worked perfectly in getting me excited as hell. It was very clear from the outset that Team Silent had the goal of one-upping their previous effort, an idea that might have seemed impossible at the time, but, well, we had no idea what we were in for. During the pre-release hype for SH3, I found myself reliving Silent Hill 2's production, and what I mean by that is, while I enjoyed the trailers and images being released, I was a little dismayed to find out I didn't recognize any of the characters being shown off. To be completely honest with you, I started to wonder if Silent Hill had turned into an anthology of unrelated stories, but before we get into how wrong I was, let's talk basics. This game, much like its predecessor, started out with a piece of media as its inspiration. Silent Hill 2 used the Russian novel Crime and Punishment as a jumping-off point, which played out as a gritty look into guilt and how humans deal with the terrible things they've done. Well, this time around it seems like Jacob's Ladder was the siren call for Team Silent, only this one wouldn't be as much of a one-to-one adaptation. Instead, Jacob's Ladder plays more of an auxiliary role, inspiring themes of questioning reality and whether or not all of this is as it seems. But these ideas tend to remain on the periphery. The main story is more of a traditional tale of, well, let's just take it from the top.
You come here and enjoy spilling their blood.
Silent Hill 3 starts off with a nightmare of a terribly creepy amusement park, and at its apex, our main character wakes up in her local mall. After a quick call to her dad to explain her lateness, she's confronted by a PI named Douglas. Apparently, he knows her name and has been paid by a person who wants to find and talk to her. In these first scenes, we get a real feel for these people. Heather clearly has a lot of love for her dad and is very obviously not in the business of taking any shit.
My name is Douglas Cartland. I'm a detective.
A detective? Really? Well, nice talking to you.
So to avoid any more time spent with a guy who looks like your local flasher, Heather ducks into the girl's bathroom and makes a hasty escape out the window. In trying to double back and lose the trenchcoat-wearing investigator, she stumbles across something unexpected, I guess. Well, maybe that's underselling the situation a bit. Now armed with what looks like a Beretta, Heather finds herself navigating an empty mall, which, now that I think about it, empty might not be the right word. It seems like the place has been flooded with creatures of the Cthulhu-esque monstrosity variety. Heather eventually finds another human, but in true Silent Hill fashion, she's more about delivering cryptic and puzzling statements, and less about properly explaining what the hell is going on around here. After what you could charitably call a conversation, Heather doubles over in pain and is introduced to a very familiar concept. That's right, our girl is having her first brush with what Harry liked to call the otherworld, which may not seem like a big deal. I mean, this is Silent Hill after all. We probably should have seen this coming, but it's not the otherworld that's causing the confusion, it's Heather, or more accurately, Heather's location. This is all taking place in Portland. Sure, we're used to Silent Hill's spiritual power being able to bring manifestations straight from your inner psyche and implement them into the real world, but how the hell is this happening outside of that cursed town? Team Silent seemed to be toying with the established mechanics of this world, and from this point on, I was absolutely hooked. I had never played a game that had me so interested right off the bat before. I mean, sure, I was initially here because of the series' pedigree, but the events happening in this very early part of the game perfectly set up a mystery I was more than happy to unravel. But I think mystery is the key word here. This game's events are better uncovered than they are explained, so as usual, I'd recommend skipping to the time on screen to avoid any spoilers to this incredible story. Okay? Alright, let's dig in a little deeper. After the mall incident and what must be the longest trip home anyone has ever taken, Heather comes home to find her father has been murdered by Claudia. And at this point, we start to ask ourselves, why the hell should we care? We've never even heard the man's voice, so why is his death being treated like such a meaningful moment? Well, take a quick look at that face. Yep, that's right, we are looking at Harry Mason, the main character of the first game, meaning Heather must be the little girl from the Good Plus ending, which of course opens a whole new world of questions as Heather and Douglas return to Silent Hill to get revenge on the woman who murdered her father. Once there, Heather starts to remember things about her past and finally begins to discover that she is essentially Alessa, and just like Alessa, she's pregnant with the physical body of the demon god Silent Hill's cult worships, which explains her being able to manifest the otherworld outside of Silent Hill and not a lot else. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this was a twist that absolutely took me for a ride. Maybe it was my young age or the fact that I rarely try to figure out a story while I'm experiencing it, but finding out that I was playing as a person that was essentially the antagonist of the last game, or at the very least a conduit for the antagonist of the last game, really blew my mind. This made these characters automatically seem more familiar to me, and I think this is where I deviate from most SH fans. In my opinion, this is an amazing story, one that stands as the absolute best example of storytelling in the series bar none.
You mock God? Traitor.
Now don't get me wrong, the absolute terror of Part 1 and the mystery and psychological aspects of Part 2 were incredibly deep and interesting, but Silent Hill 3's story does something totally different and in my opinion is much more effective for it. See, SH3's story isn't the real draw here, or should I say the events of the story aren't. What really pulls me in and makes me feel like I'm a part of this world are the characters. Now, I know this is a very subjective view, but there's something about the intersection of well-written personalities and the best voice acting I have ever heard that makes these people feel real to me. Take Heather, for instance. Sure, she's scared out of her mind and has no idea what's going on around her, but she's also mad as hell.
If I knew that, I wouldn't be so confused, would I?
She can't understand the events taking place around her, and that really pisses her off. She doesn't just politely accept the cryptic language everyone uses when they talk to her, she yells at them to make more sense. If you ask me, this makes for the perfect stand-in for her audience. I mean, how many times did you get mad at James or Harry for just going with the weird shit that comes out of other characters' mouths? How many times did you yell at your screen begging for someone to elaborate on something? I know I can't be the only one doing that. But aside from that, she's just incredibly relatable to me. I've always had a soft spot for female characters in video games, but Heather was the first character I ever controlled that made me feel this kind of connection. I know it sounds weird, but I saw where she was coming from and felt like I understood her plight. Now, obviously, this has a lot to do with the incredible talent that went into writing, voicing, and creating her, but I think there's a lot of me in there. So when I describe Silent Hill 3 as having the absolute best story in the series, I do it understanding that a lot of that is very personal to me alone, and it might be hard if not impossible to explain these things inside of my head to you guys properly. And listen, I know I review video games. Describing my own objective experience is supposed to be my job here, but sometimes I think things go a little too deep to accurately pass through the filter of coherent thought, if that makes any sense. To me, Heather might as well be real, and the people around her all feel the same. They're all me. Vincent is the more negative aspects of my personality, my greed and envy. Douglas is the part of me looking to do good in order to make up for my bad deeds. Claudia is my mindless and selfless devotion to the things and people I believe in, and my willingness to dirty my hands for a result I may not personally benefit from. And Heather? Well, she's my passion, my teenage angst I still hold on to, and my protective attitude towards my friends and family. Okay, so I know this is getting a little deeper and more personal than I normally get, and I am 100% aware that I've described almost none of the plot so far, but sometimes I gotta write what's inside, and if that means a less informative description, well, that's gonna happen every once in a while. Like I said, I can't really verbalize all the things that make me love this story, its world, and its characters so much, but I hope there was something in these meandering words that gave you even a brief glimpse of my feelings regarding this incredible work. So I guess to sum things up, if you're looking for a meaningful world populated with characters that feel so real you could swear you've met them before, I'd say Silent Hill 3 will be your Citizen Kane. This is a deeply personal story for me, and I know this hasn't exactly been the most informative critique I've ever penned, but in this one instance, I'm more interested in expressing what's inside. Sure, I started this channel with the intent of convincing my friends to play all these great games, but mostly I wanted to come to grips with what all this means to me, wrapping my head around not only what I enjoy, but why I enjoy it. But on a much less commendable job at both tying into Silent Hill 1 and wrapping up any possible loose ends the series may have had. Which does make sense, as this was supposed to be the end of the Silent Hill series, and while that didn't exactly pan out thanks to Konami wanting to milk it for every red cent it could squeeze out, you can really feel the finality of things after beating 3. It's clear this was supposed to put the nasty events of Silent Hill to sleep, and if you're even remotely interested in finding out where all these twists and turns end up, trust me, you're going to want to experience this story. So no matter what you do, whether it's emulation, real hardware, Let's Plays on YouTube, as long as it's not the HD collection, you definitely want to put yourself in a position where you can experience this story. I promise you, it will be worth your time. Silent Hill is a series that was always dedicated to emulating and improving on the survival horror experiences that made the genre great. Sure, they could have changed up the gameplay, made it fit more in line with the types of games that were more popular at the time, but Team Silent had a vision, one that they were clearly dedicated to. So why do I mention all this up front? Well, Silent Hill 3 is exactly like Silent Hill 2 in that they are both perfect progressions of the games that came before them. The same survival horror gameplay that you got used to in Part 2 is all present and accounted for, in addition to a few incremental upgrades that serve to give you more options in combat. But before we get into combat, let's talk exploration. Silent Hills 1 and 2 were pretty similar in the sense that they were separated into two distinct but overlapping sections. One where our character would be exploring the actual town of Silent Hill, and another where they would be confined to a more strict interior area. When you had the freedom to explore the town, the game toyed with a very open world kind of feel, but of course nothing like what we know as open world today. Something more akin to Stalker, where most of the environment is cut off to the player, but a bit of persistence and some luck would have them stumbling upon a cache of healing items or ammo. Now, if you'll remember in my review of SH2, I said I was a little disappointed by the fact that it spent a little less time in the town and more time navigating the narrow hallways of an interior area. Well, I'm sad to say Part 3 continues this trend with even less time spent in the actual town than Part 2. Of course, in its defense, you do spend a good chunk of the game outside of the eponymous town itself, but still, I would have loved to have seen more familiar sights. Okay, so a little bit less frantically running around Silent Hill looking for spare health drinks. It's not ideal, but there are certainly worse things, so if we're spending even more time indoors, do these parts do enough to make up the difference? Well, in my opinion, Silent Hill 3's exploration gameplay blows both of its predecessors out of the water. I think a lot of it has to do with me finding the layouts of these areas to be just the perfect cross-section between organically explorable and realistic feeling architecture. Don't get me wrong now, SH2 had amazing locations to explore, but oftentimes they would seem sort of contrived. Honestly, I'm not really sure how to explain it. Maybe too video gamey would be the right way to say it. And of course, there was my one lingering complaint with 2 not having an abrupt shift to the other world, making exploration seem like it'd last twice as long. Well, the good news is Silent Hill 3 has you bringing the other world forward at set points in the area, and just like 1, this helps immensely with keeping exploration from feeling stale. Almost like clockwork, as soon as I started to feel fatigued with an area, something would trigger Heather to manifest her fears and inner darkness into the environment. This means an altered layout and more of a challenge combat-wise, which was amazing for keeping me engaged. As far as combat goes, you guys know the deal by now. Hold the trigger button to ready, press X to attack, hold it for more powerful attacks, and there's a strafe function, once again, that I never really used. This time around, I was happy to see a few more melee implements to mess around with, and overall the combat feels much more tight and challenging. In Part 2, you really only had to position yourself correctly and make sure your swing landed first, and you were all but guaranteed a victory thanks to long stun states. In 3, enemies seem to recover from being hit much quicker, and it also feels like they have much less of a wind-up before one of their attacks land, meaning I was way more likely to take damage in a fight than I ever was in Part 2. Even when I had a good situation on my side, I would get caught with the odd close-range haymaker. This little tweak made sure combat was something I was scared of, something that served as an equalizer for the overall gameplay, and a reassurance that I would not be flush with healing items for very long. Which leads to my next point. This game is far more conservative with giving out ammo and supplies. At the end of Silent Hills 1 and 2, I was full to the brim with health drinks, first aid, and ammo. But in 3, I had to scrimp by with next to nothing for long periods of time. Sure, I had plenty of handgun ammo, but that was because I was actually running from most enemies. A tactic I only engaged in by habit in the older games instead of necessity. So yes, the game is more difficult in a traditional sense, but it's more rewarding in a survival horror sense. But they did add a couple of options that would help you mitigate this. Beef jerky can be found that will have most monsters worried about eating it instead of you, but this was always hit or miss for me. Sometimes I would put it down, it would perform its intended purpose, and sometimes monsters would just bypass it and make a beeline straight for me. This led to me not using it that much, but it's nice to have on you in a pinch. And in keeping with the theme of Team Silent making only small, incremental changes to their formula, Silent Hill 3 features items that can modify combat to a degree. From a bulletproof vest that decreases damage but reduces run speed, to a silencer that makes it easier to fight without alerting everyone in the room but decreases attack power. These little additions feel great and add a layer of complexity that wasn't present before. Of course, if you don't like messing with tradition, you can always elect not to pick these up or just not using them. For me, this was a genius way to augment your average survival horror combat without messing around too much with the pillars that make everything what it is. And speaking of which, it can have survival horror without puzzles, and I have to say the challenge here seems a little more mechanical than previous games, which I know doesn't make any sense, so let me explain. Silent Hill has always been known for puzzles like figuring out which keys on a piano to play, or where to put certain items based on some type of riddle or poem or math problem. And while 3 definitely has a few examples of this, it seems like most of the puzzles are the find obstruction then apply item to obstruction sort of variety. I was actually surprised by this, since the years have caused me to remember things slightly differently. Looking back, I always remembered the challenging puzzles in this game, but coming back to it, I was taken back when I found a more Resident Evil style approach to puzzles. Now, this isn't exactly a downside. I mean, both types are pretty damn satisfying, and it's not like the quality of these head scratchers has been diminished. They're just different, maybe in a way that only someone playing these games back to back would ever really notice. But there is one thing that got on my nerves a bit, and it's going to be very, very hard to verbalize, so here it goes. It seems like the environments were developed in such a way that they're just a bit off-center in regards to how Heather moves. Okay, so I know that doesn't make much sense, but this scene behind the mall has always been my benchmark for this. See here how I can't keep Heather in a straight line, kind of like the direction of this alley is laying in between forward and a diagonal in regards to Heather's possible degrees of movement. So why the hell would I spend so much time trying to explain such a dumb concept? Well, first off, if you're anything like me, you're going to notice it anytime you need to run long, straight lines, and, well, the rest of the gameplay is absolutely phenomenal. There's literally nothing to complain about here except for one very small thing that I can barely figure out. It's essentially the exact same experience as the game that came before it, but improved in such a way that it's totally noticeable and very subtle at the exact same time. If you ask me, this is the perfect sequel. It not only draws from what the previous games accomplished, but sets out to do even more, all without changing the general feel of playing a Silent Hill game. Without a doubt, this is the apex of the series, and even though it's not a perfect game, it is a perfect Silent Hill game. Sure, people that aren't keen on survival horror or psychological horror still might not like it, but as far as the genre goes, you just don't get better than this. To me, SH3 is one of the greatest horror games ever made. It's not only interesting and deep in that way only Silent Hill games know how to accomplish, but it's also a perfectly polished experience with next to no glitches, spelling errors, poorly programmed assets, or any of the other issues we've grown used to from modern AAA releases. So, if you're looking to spend a good portion of your time equal parts scared, excited, and suffering from extreme amounts of existential dread, and let's face it, you should be, pick up a copy of Silent Hill 3. It truly is a marvel of creative and technical know-how, and should serve as the game all modern attempts at survival horror must be compared against. Well, I've been pretty clear that this game's story and gameplay are the absolute best in the series, and I don't think I'm going to be blown any minds here when I say its presentation is also the best in its class. But even outside of a Silent Hill context, I'll be damned if this isn't one of the best looking games on the PS2. And I think most of this comes down to Team Silent's near mastery over the hardware they were working with, but a huge amount of the credit has to go to a solid eye for art and design. Sure, it's nice having what was a powerful gaming machine at their disposal, but the characters and environments would look flat and lifeless if it weren't for the team's incredible art direction and affinity for realistic lighting. Now, I know it can be hard to look at old 480i footage and hear someone calling it good looking, but check out how well it holds up against Onimusha 3, a graphically impressive game in its own right that dropped a full year after SH3. Now, I know this isn't exactly apples to apples, but Capcom scanned Jean Reno's face into the game. We can assume they were going for a more realistic look, but as you can see, Silent Hill 3 achieves it to a much more believable degree, let's say. Well, okay, comparing old PS2 games is fun as hell, but let's get back on track by comparing some more old PS2 games. Taking a look here, you can see just how much ground was covered in the short time between the release of SH2 and 3. Faces seem to have more points of articulation and animate much more fluidly, and you can see so many more little details of things like hair and clothing. And since we're making good with the comparisons, I have to mention how happy I am to see the option to disable the static overlay being available right from the get-go. I ended up playing through both versions of the game without the static filter on, and I think just like in part 2, it is a much better looking game without it. Right along with the static option, there's something much more interesting to play around with. The display option lets you toggle something essential, and one of the only things I've ever seen that made me question Team Silent's art design. For some reason I will never know, by default Silent Hill 3 uses a kind of bilinear looking filter that gets applied to all of the game's graphics. Now, I'm sure there are some of you watching right now who don't like seeing sharp pixels in their video games, and while beauty is ultimately in the eye of the beholder, well, I mean, there's just no way of getting around it. You're wrong, and honestly, I suggest you get help. But in all seriousness, I can't see any scenario where you would want to do this to your game willingly. And as a guy who first experienced the game on a CRT, I can confirm it looked even worse on its intended display text, so no blaming this one on upscaling. Why anyone at Konami thought this was a good idea, I will honestly never know, but on the plus side, they did end up giving us an option to disable it, so no harm, no foul, I guess? And going back to previous problems, this game is skewed off-center vertically just like Part 2 was. Luckily, Part 3's screen position option doesn't trigger any weird artifacts at the bottom of the screen like SH2 did, so that issue, while still a puzzle for me as far as why it's there, kind of ended up solving itself, so that's good. But hey, there were bound to be a few flies in the ointment, right? If you ask me, these guys deserve eternal credit for pushing the PS2 to these limits, but how does the game look in context to what we expect from a Silent Hill game? Well, enemy designs are definitely up to the series standard, only with this time less human-looking proportions compared to those found in 2. Enemies all seem to fall into the Lovecraftian formless horror type of look, and you really start to see the Jacob's Ladder influence when characters like Valtiel show up. There's also some nods to the first game with the incorporation of wheelchairs in parts of the environment. And since we're on the subject, man, this game has nailed realistic looking locations. Exploring the mall and subway station is incredibly surreal. These places look very convincing and show off Team Silent's well-known obsession with detail. For some reason, this area right here though, just outside of Heather's apartment, always struck a chord with me. I'm not sure if it's the lighting or design, but this place always felt real, kind of like it's somewhere I've been to before. But these locations are only half the story, and fans of the series will be happy to know that Silent Hill 3 does the other world justice. Just like its story, this is the ultimate culmination of what Silent Hill has accomplished over the years. These locations look even more uninviting and downright terrifying than they ever have. The rust is rustier and the designs are even more dreamlike. I really like that the team made the other world look much more similar to how it did in Part 1. I mean, sure, Part 2 looked awesome with its ghost town decades after it's been abandoned and possibly hit by a natural disaster kind of look, but 3 hammers home a very similar design language to the first game, which I really appreciate. Getting just a bit off the beaten path, one thing that struck me after all these years of playing Silent Hill 3 is that the game doesn't use any pre-rendered CG cutscenes, which is a really crazy idea when you consider the fact that pre-rendered cutscenes essentially sold the last game. Now, this isn't a complaint for me because I really think it helps immersion when you don't have to be teleported to a CGI world every time someone needs to talk to you, but it was a really odd concept when it struck me because I never really noticed it, which is kind of cool. Once again, a huge emphasis on realistic lighting is present here, only this time with more of a focus on colored lighting in the environment. While the flashlight still uses a per vertex solution leaving triangular boundaries visible, there's a bit of a blur applied to the effect, which makes it much harder to notice. The same perspective correct shadows can be found on a lot of assets in the environment, and to this day, these still blow me away. One of my all-time favorite areas is the subway train near the start of the game. This one spot uses such an amazing blend of real-time and pre-baked lighting, great texture work, and realistic design to make this one area seem legitimately real to me. But hey, we're spending all this time talking about how good Silent Hill looks in the context of a PS2 game, but there is another option. A PC version of SH3 was rolled out only a few months after the original, and in a move that surprised the hell out of me and everyone I knew, Konami actually made up for their shoddy job porting SH2. Included is a configuration tool letting you set resolutions up to 1280 by 1024, and the game even lets you set rendering resolution, effectively allowing for a super sampled image. Once again, this is a port that I snagged on launch, and the experience compared to SH2's nasty PC version is night and day. I had no issues getting this up and running on my old Dell Optiplex back in the day, and everything from graphics to sound just seemed to work with no fuss. And I do have good news for you, modern operating systems do produce a similar result. I'm running this game essentially stock with the exception of a widescreen patch allowing me to get a full 1080p out of this bad boy, and I gotta say, it looks out of this world. Seeing these incredible looking PS2 assets in even more positive light is a life-changing event, and if you don't agree that PS2 graphics upscaled to 1080p isn't life-changing, well, I think you may have stumbled across the wrong YouTube channel. For real though, there's so much detail here, and the dark black levels really help draw you in. Sure, I still have a soft spot for the PS2 original, but damn, it's hard not to jump ship and fully recommend this version. Unlike Part 2's PC port, there are far less inaccuracies to be found, and I gotta assume that's because there was no Xbox version to pull from. Whoever ported this game just had to bring over the full PS2 base experience, and it's a better game for it. Of course, there are a few flaws that become noticeable with the increased fidelity, but they're pretty small. For example, in some scenes you can see a squared off boundary for Heather's flashlight lens flare, and if you're really scrutinizing the environment, you might notice a few low-res textures, which honestly is totally understandable. I mean, we are pushing this game much further than it was intended to go. Now, a back-to-back comparison isn't exactly fair in this scenario, but just for shits and giggles, let's see what we get. Obviously, the PC version takes the win here with its incredible look, accurate porting, widescreen capabilities, X-input support, and, well, more accessible nature if you're keen on sailing the high seas, if you get my drift. In my opinion, I still have to side with the PS2 original based more on my initial experience on the platform and my flat-out love for the console's impressively unique video output, but even I have to admit the PC version is probably the best option to go for if you're trying to play Silent Hill 3 right now. Honestly though, it doesn't matter which version you go with. Either way, you'll be looking at one of the most graphically impressive titles of its day, and hey, disagree if you want, but to me, Silent Hill 3 looks much better than most Xbox 360 launch games. Now, most of this is thanks to a near maniacal level of attention to detail and a strong focus on art design, and while I can admit a bit of a bias on my part, I just don't think any other console of its day could have produced such incredible results. So I'm happy to say, whether it's PS2, PC, or even emulation, this is a game you absolutely have to see with your own eyes, because if your dead body's gonna get drug away by a tall, otherworldly creature, it better be a high-fidelity, tall, otherworldly creature. Well, by now you guys have probably noticed I don't spend as much time on Akira Yamaoka's incredible music in these videos, and trust me, it's not from a lack of interest. These soundtracks are some of the finest music I've ever heard, but despite my background in recording music and fronting a band, I still just lack the words to express how amazing this stuff is. Well, luckily I have a friend who does not suffer from this problem. Evan over at the YouTube channel Game Music Minutia knows two things above all else: Silent Hill and how to describe music, so in the interest of finally having someone on here who knows what the hell they're talking about, take it away, Evan.
Hi everyone, this is Evan, also known as Game Music Minutia. As Jared explained, I love talking about game music, and as my early years of work on YouTube proved, Silent Hill is one of my favorite sets of scores to praise, so let's just get right to it. Through the first 4 entries in the series, composer and sound designer Akira Yamaoka managed to elevate the already beautiful and haunting visuals within the Team Silent games, making the scores and sounds an integral component of what we know as Silent Hill. Starting with the first entry, Yamaoka pulled inspiration from unlikely places, like Twin Peaks composers Angelo Badalamenti, to create tracks that feature a melding of industrial, experimental tones with freeform and oftentimes avant-garde jazz. What's more, the impeccable sound design, from the sound of Harry's footsteps on metal grates to the incessantly terrifying radio feedback, brings Silent Hill to life, while also teaching the player how to differentiate between danger and safety. Pretty cool. Yamaoka carried that same quality to Silent Hill 2, however, bringing a refined focus on characterization. If Silent Hill's score was designed to inject added soul into the sleepy town, then Silent Hill 2's was crafted to distinguish the differences and similarities between the characters trapped there. Tracks like Promise, Heaven's Night, and Theme of Laura help us step into the emotional states of James, Maria, and Laura, even if we didn't realize it on a conscious level. And then came Silent Hill 3, which, in my personal opinion, served as a showcase for Yamaoka's best work in the series. Heather's struggle to understand her troubled identity and not conform to the town's will was brilliantly represented in Yamaoka's scores. Every song had a dual nature, reminiscent of Heather's confrontation with the pagan zealot, Claudia. Breeze in Monochrome Night and Dance with Nightwind, for example, feature the iconic experimental and industrial ambient sounds we've come to associate with Silent Hill, especially in the first entry, but fused with delicate piano melodies and steady beats, which could be representative of Heather and her sense of modern normalcy. In other words, it's an auditory play on the old world mixing with the new world. In addition, Silent Hill 3's score features several songs with lyrics, like the killer I Want Love, which brings some lounge-style music to the overall package. And pro tip, get the album and listen to the studio mix of I Want Love because it's life-changing. There's so much more I could say about the soundtrack, but for the sake of time and not hijacking Jared's video, I'll leave the praise there for now. Thanks for listening. It means a great deal, and everyone watching should be happy to know that they're supporting a great guy who works extremely hard to bring us content on so many amazing games. So thanks again, Jared. Back to you.
If this really is the work of God, then I'd say she has lousy taste.
Well, by now, I hope my feelings on the matter are very, very clear. In my opinion, 3 is not only leaps and bounds above the other amazing entries in this series, but above most other PS2 games as far as satisfying gameplay, incredibly immersive stories, and razor-sharp graphics are concerned. This is truly the result of Team Silent's collective talent reaching some kind of theoretical maximum goodness. It's a culmination of all their techniques and know-how built up over the years, and it's fitting that Silent Hill 3 have that honor, as it was intended to be the last game of the franchise according to certain members of the team. I mean, it makes sense they would go out with a bang, and even though it sucks to have something you've enjoyed for 3 entries and 2 console generations come to an end, it's nice being present for a climactic ending to an incredibly interesting saga. But if you ask me, that's what makes it truly impactful. An ending. Sure, Silent Hill's world's seemingly infinitely interesting, but knowing it could last forever is not appealing to me. I like things concluding in a satisfactory way, and without spoiling anything, SH3 is exactly that. It's a very fitting end to the long and sometimes confusing tale of a foggy vacation town and the cult that lives within it. Now, I know we're only 3 videos in and I have already given away my feelings on the rest of the series, but I'll put it bluntly. If you're here waiting for me to cover a game in the series that tops 3 in production value, art direction, playability, or good storytelling, well, that's a long wait for a train don't come. Silent Hill 3 is for me the concept of skilled game creation made real. It represents my expectations for sequels to beloved franchises and is the reason I'm mostly disappointed with modern video game creation. Sure, we have more tech and advertising available to us than ever before, but we seem to have lost sight of what makes people play deep, meaningful, story-driven video games. We've somehow lost the character that was forged in the furnace of console limitations and very narrow genre borderlines. You know, when I think about it, maybe that's why Silent Hill 3 means so much to me. Maybe it represents the last of a dying breed, a group of misfits all dedicated to producing real art and given the financial freedom to do so by what should have been a soulless AAA company. I doubt very much that I will ever see a game like 3 again in my lifetime, and honestly, I'm okay with that. This will always be a story and experience that will stick with me, and it's in that I have to admit one thing. You guys never stood a chance at getting a fair, unbiased review of this game. But if you're not currently furiously typing me an effigy in the comment section for something I've said here, I hope I've either made you want to give 3 a shot, or at the very least, made a reasonable case for my side of the argument. And if I didn't, well, the good news is we'll be shitting on the Silent Hill HD collection next, so maybe stick around for that one. And to those few brave souls that made it this far, thank you very, very much for watching the Silent Hill Retrospective. Alright, so before we get into what'll likely be 15 straight minutes of me screaming into a microphone, I gotta talk shop with you guys. As you may have heard, new regulations have made YouTube a relatively shaky platform to make a living off of. Well, more shaky than usual is probably more accurate. The rule has always been content like mine will always make less money than your average family-friendly stuff, but now on top of that, anything seen as remotely family-friendly but not listed as such runs the risk of bringing down a $40,000 fine from the FTC, an amount of money I've never even seen all at once before. So if there was ever a time to support content you enjoy, it's now. I have my Patreon linked here on screen and in the description, and if you think independent game reviews with a focus on retro video on original hardware is worth $1 a month, well, I'd sure appreciate it. If for whatever reason you can't or don't want to throw some support my way, maybe think about doing it for someone else you enjoy. I guarantee you they likely need it more than you know. And for those of you that can't for any reason at all, thank you anyways. You guys have brought me feelings of satisfaction I never dreamed of, and I love you all for it. So with that in mind, enough shilling, let's dive face first into this turd. Well guys, we have made it to the video a lot of you have been waiting for. The Silent Hill HD collection is world renowned for its terrible quality. Stories of its corner-cutting, bad decisions, and flat-out incomplete nature of its final product have been told far and wide. But have you had the courage to jump in and see this disaster for yourself? Well, I don't know about you guys, but I've never touched this accursed box. That is until today. Yep, I dirtied my hands with this abomination to finally figure out exactly what was done wrong here and what, if anything, could have been done to save it. And for those of you looking to save a bit of watch time, I will not be taking on the entire internet and singing this remaster's praises. This collection is exactly as bad as you've heard. The goal today is just to explain exactly why that is, and hell, maybe figure out what led to all this madness. So strap in, SH fans, and make sure to keep an eye on the newcomers. This is going to be an incredibly bumpy ride. So, last chance to chicken out. No? Alright everybody, welcome to Silent Hill. Silent Hill, a series that started a bit of a revolution. It led the way for games that were looking to deliver a more visceral horror experience. Yeah, for a while Silent Hill was a trusted name that assured a certain quality of design, but nothing lasts forever, and sadly after SH4, Konami saw fit to break the band up. Team Silent, the group of misfits that had issues following orders and shared a creative vision of how horror games should work, were no more, and the Big K wanted other developers to get a shot at the franchise. And regardless of how you feel about that decision, the fact of the matter is, core fans of the original games felt cheated. The series and sometimes characters that they loved were being used in ways the original creators would have never stood for. Of course, it turned out there would be no shiny new graphics, as this was more of a remaster than an HD collection, which brought up a few issues. Sure, a 16:9 aspect ratio and a higher operating resolution were nothing to sneeze at, but a lot of us were already experiencing these modern comforts with the PC versions of 2 and 3. You know, the versions that were already capable of all these things. And that wasn't even the worst issue. This so-called collection wasn't anywhere near complete. Only Silent Hills 2 and 3 would be included, and if the goal was to make money off of series nostalgia, why not include the game that started it all? Well, the answer to that was pretty obvious on its face. They would have had to have remade the original PS1 game if they wanted it to share the same HD look as the other two, which was understandable, but still a bitter pill to swallow. And then they would go on to contradict even this idea by not including the other PS2 release in the series, Silent Hill 4. So no matter how you look at it, fans were getting screwed one way or another. And all of this was just some of the drama that went down before the game hit shelves. The real chaos that is this game's existence wouldn't be clear until it was spinning in 360s and PS3s around the world. And from here I want to lay out some ground rules. First off, we will absolutely be comparing these so-called remasters to the source material. I know some people would want these games judged based on their own performance, even though they would fail that metric too, but these are adaptations, so we're going to treat them like any other port of a beloved franchise here on Avalanche Reviews, and that means scrutinizing the absolute shit out of them. Second, the footage will be coming from the PS3 version of the games with no patches applied. Now, I know there were some issues fixed with a patch eventually, but most people who played these games had to play them for months and months in this state, and my goal here is to analyze the product of their work and not their last-minute rushed patch job. And with that out of the way, alright, let's dive in.
Torn flesh, smashed bones, spattered blood.
First and foremost, we have to deal with the presentation side of things. Now, I know what you're thinking. What could be wrong with the graphics? Isn't this just the original games but up-resed? And in a perfect world, that's exactly what it would be. But we're not living in that world. We're living in a world where Konami would give the go-ahead to start an HD remaster project after they had lost the source code to the games being remastered, and a company with zero knowledge of breaking down and recreating a game in higher resolutions would sign up to be the ones to do it. So what we ended up with was a plethora of inaccuracies and differences, all piled on top of a solid core of graphical nonsense. Now, those of you who watched my video on Silent Hill 2 will know Team Silent worked very hard on a real-time lighting engine. In fact, I'd say it was one of the best looking features of the game, second only to the drop-dead gorgeous cutscenes, a subject we will definitely be talking about shortly. But as you know, the way the real-time lighting was implemented turned into a real source of frustration when porting SH2 to other platforms, mostly because it was achieved by utilizing the PS2's hardware in very interesting and mostly out-of-spec ways. ways that wouldn't translate to other tech very easily. So, how did Hijinks handle this very delicate and technically involving process? Well, that's easy. They broke the absolute hell out of it. See here in this cutscene, the shadows cast by the bars cut off at the top, and at another area in the Woodside Apartments, you can see the dark clearing out like a fog of war in an RTS game. But I think we both know those aren't the only examples to talk about. Shadows are totally broken across the board, as seen here where some seriously messed up stuff is going on with these shelves. It's clear that zero amounts of time went into bug testing this problem, since the example with the bars is in the first 20 minutes of the game. Playtesters had to have seen this issue, which wouldn't be the only problem so early in the game. Silent Hill 2 also suffers from a real odd issue with its pillar boxing. Now, I know some people think the pillar boxes should be there and others think it looks better without them, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure what side of that conflict I'm on, but I am sure Hijinks should have definitely picked one, because they come and go, sometimes even within the same scene. Make sure to keep your eyes on the black bars on the top and bottom of the screen and witness as the game decides to ditch and bring them back over and over again. Once again, this shows the exact level of care put into these remasters. This cutscene is in the first 10 minutes of gameplay. Either this means no one noticed the obvious issue here, or they didn't find it important enough to fix. And to be completely honest, both options are equally damning, since project lead Tom Hewlett claims he petitioned Konami for this idea on the grounds of him being a Silent Hill superfan. And you know how I can prove that's not the case? Silent Hill's fog, the one thing that defines the series, the one thing that must be done right, is an absolute mess in this collection. With both games, the fog is much lighter and less thick than the originals, sometimes not showing up at all. Hell, there are points where it's so thin that you're able to see things you weren't meant to, like here in this cutscene where you can actually see the boundaries of the map and where they terminate into nothing. Of course, if you're not mega familiar with the originals, you might not notice some of this, but I'm confident you'll notice the hard line that is the fog's boundaries. I mean, look at this, it's so poorly done you can actually see the line where the fog is drawn in. I probably shouldn't have to mention this, but this is not how it looks in the originals. I would also sometimes get an issue where fog would interact with other stuff in the background, creating this big bright ball of white light. And sadly, this level of incompetence was not limited to Silent Hill 2 by a long shot. Yes, the very best game in the series, in my opinion, got the same lazy, destructive treatment as Part 2. The first thing I was really able to notice in Heather's little romp through self-realization are the incredibly hard edges found on shadows. This tells me they didn't just scale up the original lighting effects, since here in the original we can see that shadows have had their edges softened, which makes them look more real and convincing compared to the razor-sharp edges on the HD collection. And getting back to the fog again, all of it is missing from this intro scene. Now, what possible reason could there have been to not include such a key aspect of this game's visual style? Well, other than laziness, of course. And moving back to Silent Hill 2, we have to get into the absolute terrible job these guys did with that game's biggest selling point. Back in the day, these 60 field per second cutscenes were the talk of the industry, and for good reason. Their smooth, fluid motion and incredibly detailed look are still impressive today, but sadly that is not the case with the remaster. For some reason, instead of grabbing the PS2 originals and working some up conversion / progressive scan magic on them, Hijinks just snagged the 30 frame per second highly compressed cutscenes from the Xbox version of the game and proceeded to shit all over them. In order to get these CGs running at a faux 60 frames per second, these absolute monsters added interpolated frames in between each real frame of video. And what I mean by that is every other frame is a composite of the previous and next frame blurred together. This leads to a blurry overall look and an insane amount of ghosting. Which is the craziest part of all this, because these fools went through all of this effort to get 60 FPS versions of these cutscenes working, instead of just ripping the gorgeous PS2 originals that already ran at that frame rate. Sure, 60 interlace fields per second is not the same as 60 progressive scan frames per second, but are you telling me my $300 FrameMeister can deinterlace and upconvert these videos just fine, but the hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment at Hijinks' disposal can't? Without a doubt, this is the most confusing and infuriating aspect we've covered so far, and fair warning, it's only going to get worse from here. It's also worth noting there's no longer an option to turn on sharp display mode in Part 3, but the game's so sharp there's really no need for it anymore. And this is where, in the name of fairness, I do have to give some compliments. So let's hurry up and get this over with. Both games actually look quite good given the HD treatment, or at least they do in some select scenarios. Some of you may have noticed that I'm actually playing Part 2 with the static filter on, and that's because it looks really good. My main issue with the original game's static was the individual grains were too large and it obscured how great the game could look normally, but the implementation here is damn near perfect. Looking at the options side by side, and trust me, it does hurt to say this, the HD collection takes the win here. And in another odd victory, Hijinks replaced the lossy pre-rendered cutscene at the start of Silent Hill 3 with actual in-game graphics. Now I know it doesn't sound like a big deal, but this video always stood out since it was the only one in the game that was pre-rendered, and it was done so at a very high compression rate, so it didn't look very good. This is pretty out of character for Team Hijinks, as their modus operandi so far has been to do the least amount of work humanly possible, but they actually had to grab the scenes present in this pre-render from the in-game cutscenes, which is probably the most amount of effort I've seen in this remaster so far. Not that it's very much, mind you. Also of note are some 2D assets that seem to have either been redrawn or replaced with higher res originals. Now, it's worth saying that not everything got this treatment, but some things like text and maps look really good. Now, I would have of course preferred sharper, more pixelated text like that found in the original when upscaled, but the softer font used here does fit the quote-unquote HD look pretty well if I'm being honest. And I know I already talked about it, but SH3 is amazingly sharp in this collection. During cutscenes, it's easy to just sit back and marvel at how good it looks. But all of that sharpness does come at a price we'll talk about a bit later. Okay, so there are a few compliments worth giving out here, but overall this HD remaster is an absolute mess graphically speaking. I wish it were just inaccuracies, because then I could admit that the fanboy in me resents the collection, but newcomers could play this version of the games and get a good approximation of what the originals were like. As we've seen though, it's not just inaccurate. These remasters break things that worked perfectly before and manage to ruin the look of the originals instead of improving it. And on top of that, the bastards had the gall to replace the font design with Comic Sans. Someone start a petition immediately. Actually, I don't really care about that as much as everybody else seems to. Yeah, it's kind of funny, but I don't know why everybody lost their mind over this. From the very start, it's clear that Tom Hewlett and his team had absolutely no idea what the hell they were doing. I mean, why did they work with unfinished PS2 code instead of looking to the PC versions both games already had? These ports could already hit HD resolutions, and it couldn't have been too hard to reverse engineer them. Well, I think we all know the answer to that question, but there's still a query that needs attention. Speaking purely from a graphical standpoint, should someone new to the series and looking to experience these games in a more modern HD light play the HD collection? And the answer is a very firm no. Not only do these games look worse than the originals, but they do so unnecessarily. HD versions of these games are already available on PC, and even the integrated graphics baked into my $70 Ryzen 2200G can handle them at 1080p. So no matter what you're rocking, it is almost assured you can play these games at a much higher level of fidelity than what's on offer here. So I'd say it's only fitting for you to avoid this collection with the same creative zeal and energy Team Hijinks puts into avoiding doing real work.
So, the hotel was your special place, huh? I'll bet it was.
Okay, so the graphics here are terrible, that's unquestionable, but a bad-looking game isn't the end of the world as long as it plays well, so I'm sure all of the lazy and poor decisions that went into up-resing the graphics didn't bleed over into gameplay, right? I mean, the game was already programmed and gameplay already existed, so all that's left is just to copy it over. There's absolutely no way they could have fucked up the gameplay, right? Well, the good news, or the bad news, depending on how you look at it, is the gameplay issues are spread pretty evenly across both of these games, but oddly enough, each game is broken in its own unique and interesting way. Starting off with 3, we see giant, and I mean giant dips from a max of 60 frames per second to what feels like lower than 20. Now, this might not have been so noticeable if the game was locked at 30 FPS, and believe me, the last thing I want is a game running at a slower frame rate, but when you drop 40 frames, it's much more of an issue than if you had only dropped 10. And when frames start dropping, prepare for slow motion, something I wish was a joke, but sadly is not. You'll find it does it at the most inconceivable times. Like here in this hallway, I was getting a lot of slowdown when these closers were on screen, but after I pass them, it gets even slower somehow. You've probably also noticed that there are random hangs where the game will freeze for just a split second. This actually happens a lot more the further into the game you get, and it never stops being annoying. Even here in an empty hallway with no 3D models on screen other than Heather, there are freezes, slowdowns, and some really odd-looking ghosting. Here in the subway, it seems the actual environment is causing both slowdown and ghosting, as you can see when I move the camera around. Now, the slowdown, aside from being absolutely ridiculous for a PS2 game running on a PS3, is a complete mystery. Sure, when resources get a little tight, some slowdown is going to happen, but there's no reason at all it should be causing ghosting, especially during a cutscene where only one character is on screen at a time. I can't for the life of me think of a situation where these two issues went hand in hand, but hey, don't you worry, the poor programming didn't forget to bless Silent Hill 2 with damn near game-breaking issues as well. And sure, slowdown is an issue here as well, but for some reason it's not quite as bad as we saw with Part 3. Instead of slowdown making the game hard to play though, it's a long, pointless fade to and from black that takes place anytime a cutscene is triggered, you look at your map or go to your inventory screen. An issue that was kind of present in the original, but the length has easily been doubled in the HD collection. Thanks to this, some cutscenes in the game are completely missing as they start and stop all in the amount of time it takes for the game to display graphics again. The biggest contender being the Pyramid Head introduction. This is a pivotal scene that represents Team Silent's theme of sex and death throughout the game, but a large portion of context is missing here as it takes so long to actually be able to see it. Now, of course, every black cloud has its silver lining, and for both of these games, I'm sure series vets will be able to appreciate the much shorter load times. Some doors in SH3 can take a little bit to load to the next room on real hardware, but the HD collection makes this a nearly instant process. Then again, this is often undone with long fades to black and terrible slowdowns, so it kind of evens out honestly. Regardless of which game you decide to play, the Silent Hill HD collection will serve as the absolute worst way to experience that game. I honestly had to force myself to play through these piles of trash, and that's really saying something. Both Silent Hills 2 and 3 are some of my absolute favorite video games of all time, and yet I kept making excuses not to play them. For example, I'm writing this sentence right now because I got to the subway station in SH3, saved the game, and decided starting a Word document would be a more entertaining use of my time. Listen, if the graphical screw-ups weren't enough to scare you away from this collection, I honestly hope the gameplay issues will, because I really do want you guys to play these games, but without a doubt, this bastardized remaster is not the way you want to do that. More than an HD collection, this game serves as a physical representation of what happens when a company lacking oversight teams up with a man with the world's largest ego. Well, so far we've covered the objective stuff, problems with gameplay, graphical shortcomings, and all manner of glitches, but here's where we get subjective, and by subjective I mean personal. If you've watched the rest of my Silent Hill retrospective, you'll know these games really do mean something to me, especially Silent Hill 3. These characters, the world they live in, and the trials they go through are all very much a part of me, and I don't have a problem admitting this is when I get pissed. See, Tom Hewlett had a few other plans when pitching this HD remaster project to Konami. He wanted to hire all new voice actors and pen an entirely new script for them to read. Of course, re-rendering cutscenes with new lip syncing would have been impossible without the game's source code and some people who knew what they were doing. Two things sorely lacking on this project. So he decided to settle for replacing the voice actors of two games that were world-renowned for having an amazing voice cast. Now, I'll be the first to admit they didn't skimp on the VA budget. The voice of Joel from The Last of Us and all-around stud Troy Baker is here to voice James.
I'm looking for Mary. Have you seen her?
And Mary Elizabeth McGlenn, the absolute talent behind Major Kusanagi in the best anime ever aired on TV, Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, signed on as well. Guys, there's no getting around it. These are top-tier voice actors. They played some amazing roles, and I am without a doubt a fan of their work. That being said, they absolutely butchered this game. But before I go off on a tangent, let's talk about all the reasons they were needed at all. As the HD collection started to get press, James Sunderland's original voice actor, Guy Seehee, contacted Konami looking for money he believed he was owed. See, Konami only ever paid him for his initial work on the PS2 version of SH2, and this HD remaster would essentially be using his motion capture and voiceover work without compensating him. Of course, it is important to point out that residual income isn't really a thing in video game voice acting traditionally, but legally speaking, there is a precedent for it. Now, Konami does claim Guy signed a contract allowing them to do this, but Guy claims otherwise, of course. After this whole shit show hit the internet, the new voice actors went on attack, making sure everyone hated Guy for wanting to be, in my opinion, fairly compensated for his work. And what really killed it for me was how hard Mary Elizabeth McGlynn went after him. She made sure to bash him anytime she made a public appearance, and a lot of the times lied about the situation.
He said, you owe me 10 years of royalties. I'm gonna call the other actors. They're all gonna get royalties too, and we're gonna sue you, blah, blah, blah.
I mean, this was an artist I really respected. Her voice work was incredible, and her vocal talent on Akira Yamaoka's music just can't be denied. But in this one situation, she was very clearly in the wrong and acting kinda like an ass. Well, Guy would eventually decide to allow for the use of his voice and motion capture work, and even used his pull with the fans to push Tom Hewlett into allowing for players to have the option for new and old voices. Sadly, Silent Hill 3 did not have such a happy ending. For some reason still unknown, Part 3 would only have the new voice cast as an option, and, well, it's about time we get into that.
You gonna be okay alone?
I'm not a child, you know.
I'm gonna make a bold statement here. These very talented and impressive voice actors flat out suck in this game. Now, I know what you're thinking, and yes, this is the opinion of a biased fanboy, but I do have some more objective evidence to back these claims up, based on my experience sharpening my vocal chops here on YouTube and in recording/performing music live. So why not start out with the needless and ridiculous amount of reverb applied to every single spoken word in both of these games?
I just pricked myself.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Now, I'm no audio engineer, but reverb like this is only supposed to be used to simulate an environment that could cause such an echo, but I doubt very much an open graveyard filled with fog would cause a lot of natural reverb.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry. I was just...
No, it's okay. I didn't mean to...
Here in this tall, echoey entryway to the mall, reverb is totally acceptable and even expected. This open-air alleyway, well, not so much. Another issue I had was the way voices are dropped into a scene with no effort to blend them. Now, this was a problem I struggled with for a while. Something just sounded off and I had no idea how to describe it, but I think I've come up with something. Here, listen to this clip and try to pay attention to how well the voices blend in with the scene and the environment around them.
I'm on your side.
So you say. But how do I know you're not with her?
Her? You mean Claudia? Please don't lump me together with her. She was totally brainwashed by that crazy old hag.
Now the same exact clip, but with the new voice actors and recording.
So you say. But how do I know you're not with her?
Her? You mean Claudia? Please don't lump me together with her. She was brainwashed by that crazy old hag.
See how the voices sound like they've been layered over the clip? It's almost like the original voices are actually coming out of the characters' mouths, but the new ones are just somewhere in the sound field. There's never a difference in volume when characters are further or closer to the camera either, and you're never really spatially aware of who's saying what. I'm sure this has to do with bad mixing, but it's almost like they layered the voices on top of every other sound, and it leads to what I can only describe as an old kung fu movie dubbed in English.
What do you want? Is that one-eyed bastard here? Who the hell are you? You dare call our boss that?
Compounding this issue is the terrible lip syncing you're gonna find.
James. Wait a minute. I'm kinda tired.
Now, obviously these new actors aren't going to be able to perfectly replicate the original pace and delivery of the old voices, so this was necessarily going to happen. But someone far more petty than I might point out this would be a very obvious argument against re-recording the voices in the first place. Now, sticking more in the realm of the objective, some of the voice actors were poorly cast regardless of their talent. Laura's voice makes it very, very painfully obvious we're listening to a woman in her late 30s act like a child, compared to the actual child who voiced Laura in the original.
What is it?
A letter from Mary.
What?
I want to go get it. Is that okay?
Yes.
And sadly, the same issue repeats itself with Heather. In the original, Heather sounded like a teenager. In the HD collection, she sounds like a grown woman trying to sound like a teenager and failing horribly.
A detective? Really? Well, nice talking to you.
For some reason, Troy Baker saw fit to drop into a deep, breathy low register plagued with awful sounding vibrato, and regardless of whether or not you like the way this sounds, it clearly doesn't fit James's look or build.
You can't open it?
Yeah. Maria, give me a hand here.
I almost feel like this was intentional since Mary Elizabeth has a naturally low voice and maybe She wanted a consistent sound to the two main characters. Who knows, honestly? All I know is these new voice actors, with almost no exceptions, do not fit the established characters they're coming out of. And yeah, if you haven't noticed, we have just crossed over into the realm of subjective fanboy anger. Aside from these voices not fitting their characters, they change the overall mood of the game. And I know that sounds dumb, but think about it. These voices were a pivotal aspect of the game's development. They were recorded after physically acting these scenes out for motion capture. They fit perfectly with the actions on screen because the same people perform those actions. No matter how talented the new cast is, they could never be as convincing given the circumstances. On top of this, these new guys sometimes deliver lines with totally new emotions, which really clashes with the feel of some scenes.
If I knew that, I wouldn't be so confused, would I?
If I knew that, I wouldn't be so confused, would I?
There's also a few small rewrites, and for the life of me, I can't imagine why Tom Hewlett would do this. I mean, here's a guy who claims to be the ultimate SH fan, thinking the series needs to be perfected, and by him no less. Very rarely does the guy cleaning paintings at a museum hold himself in as high regard as the original artist who made the works he's in charge of dusting off every night. And all of this isn't taken into account the nearly infinite amount of audio glitches, misplaced pieces of music, altered sound effects, and whatever the hell this is. Listen, I know Tom Hewlett got a lot of hate for what he's done to this series, and while I don't like the idea of people getting harassed, it's not exactly hard to see why that happened. He came to Konami with the idea of a remaster, but what he really wanted was a remake, and luckily the entire world laughed in his face as he failed to competently run a much smaller affair. The fact of the matter is, the HD collection is more than just a failed remaster. It's a slap in the face of every Silent Hill fan. Not only is every aspect of these ports better represented than PC versions of these games, but more accurately as well. Sure, there are some things that didn't successfully make the jump from PS2 to PC, but after what I played today, these may as well be perfect recreations carved in solid gold by comparison. No matter what you do or what your experience with the series is, please stay away from this collection. It is a work of pure hubris and incompetence. Not only does it sully what used to be a respected name in gaming, but also makes these games harder to pass on to future generations. I mean, think about it. Imagine your first time with a series was an experience not only marred with slowdown and weak voice acting, but design decisions and glitches so bad they can lock your console and corrupt your save data. Now, does that sound like a series of games that you're interested in further pursuing? Of course not. The Silent Hill HD collection has likely scared off more people from the series than antiquated controls in a dead genre ever will. So if you're looking to see me burn this game alive, well, here it is. This is an offensive piece of garbage that has no right having the words Silent Hill printed on its cover. A disc that would be better served acting as the lining of my cat's litter box than spinning in one of my consoles. And more than that, this was a terrible waste of what could have been an amazing event in video games. Something that could have brought back the survival horror genre. And I sincerely hope everyone involved in making it never find work in this industry again. May the Silent Hill HD collection go down in history as the worst Konami game ever made.
They're huge. Will you stop?
Oh, god damn it. Well guys, I gotta say, it's good to see you all again, but I kinda thought we were finished here. Heather's little tale of self-discovery is over with, and the demon god she carried inside of her now only exists on the pages of a certain secret cult's holy scriptures, so I'm left wondering what exactly has brought us together again. I could have swore we put an end to all these odd events, but even now I can't help but feel like there's just one more story stuck here within the walls of some crumbling building. One more series of events we're meant to see, so I guess we better see this thing through to the end. And with that in mind, you guys better strap in. This is going to be one very weird trip. Oh, and for the newcomers, welcome to Silent Hill. Silent Hill 4: The Room is a very divisive title in the Silent Hill series, and if you ask me, there are a few very good reasons for that. First and foremost is the fact that it was never meant to be a Silent Hill game at all, and I know just the mere mention of that has some of you furiously typing in the comment section, but after an insane amount of time spent researching this game, trust me, it's not just a fan theory. According to both members of Team Silent and the team that developed The Room, this is most certainly the case, and I'm sure you've noticed that I differentiated Team Silent from the team that made this game, and that's because most of the people involved in this game's creation were only tacitly involved with Team Silent. Oftentimes, The Room is described as being made by Team Silent's B team, a group of background artists, font designers, and people who organize data onto game disks. But if you ask me, Team Silent is the sum of its whole and not something that can be broken down into one or two key members. The Room's director, Suguro Murakoshi, while contributing to Silent Hill 2 as a scenario writer, never had any input on series canon. And while Akira Yamaoka's music in the series is now and forever will be absolutely incredible, he's never contributed to any original Silent Hill story. To further add weight to this, 4 was in development during SH3's production, so the core of Team Silent simply couldn't have been involved. I mean, sure, technically the guy grabbing everyone's coffee in the office was a contributing member of Team Silent, but I doubt very much his involvement made or broke the series. So no, The Room was not made by Team Silent, despite the fact that nearly 30% of them were present. And if you disagree with that, I have some lovely swampland to sell you here in South Florida. It's nearly 30% actual land. As for SH4's origin as a non-Silent Hill game, well, that's another hotly contested idea, and for the life of me, I cannot understand why. I mean, the game's producer said in an interview with Games World, well, keep in mind, SH4 was not originally supposed to be a Silent Hill game. And then there's 4's art director, Masashi Tsuboyama, responding to Eurogamer, confirming that the game didn't start off as a Silent Hill game, and then further specifying the game started its life as Room 302 and existed outside of Silent Hill, only to be rolled into the series later. And I know what you're thinking. Well, Jared, that's only 2 of the key members of the game's development staff and core members of Team Silent. That's not enough proof for me. Well, then there's Akira Yamaoka, who seems to be rationalizing the reason for The Room's inclusion into SH right there on the spot during an interview. Now, I know some of you guys will be able to find quotes stating the contrary, but you gotta ask yourself, why would nearly the entire team behind this game say it was never meant to be a Silent Hill title? I mean, think about it, they gain nothing from saying this, while Konami on the other hand stands to lose a good chunk of invested money in the project if it's not carrying a very famous name, maybe Silent Hill for instance. Hopefully I've illuminated the subject for a lot of you, and if you remain unconvinced, well, let's face it, I never really had a chance of changing your mind anyways, but I do appreciate you hearing me out. So with all the controversial stuff out of the way, let's get to the other controversial stuff I will definitely be saying in this review.
I think I'm gonna puke.
The Room starts off with our main character, Henry Townsend, just a normal guy living in an everyday normal apartment. With the exception of the fact that he is physically unable to leave said apartment and has been suffering from bad dreams for the last week or so, which, on a personal note, I always thought was kind of funny. The game sort of gives more prominence to the bad dreams at first, instead of the infinitely worse issue of the assortment of chains on his front door keeping him from leaving. He's all like, damn, it kinda sucks being stuck in what seems like a pocket universe that keeps me from breaking free from my apartment, but yo, these nightmares are something else. Anyways, Henry's handling the whole situation impressively well when a hole suddenly opens up in his bathroom, and after deciding to crawl through it, which is what you do, he wakes up in a subway station and meets with what I can only describe as a woman of ill repute.
I'm kinda scared all alone. I'll do a special favor for you later.
But sadly, the friendship is short-lived. After finding her bloody body with numbers carved into her chest, our boy wakes up in his bed and notices that emergency workers are pulling a body out of the same subway station and describing the numbers carved into her.
Hurry up and get that ambulance. Quit yapping and move her already. Damn, she's got numbers carved into her chest. I wonder if...
And sadly, here's where we have to cut it for you newcomers. Thanks to the confusing and tangled nature of this story, much of its appeal comes from uncovering it yourself, so you guys know the deal. Skip to the time on screen or the link in the description to make sure I don't spoil anything for you. Alright, so with that out of the way, throughout the story, roughly these same exact situations keep playing themselves out, with Henry running into future murder victims
Finally, it's gonna happen!
and almost always failing to save them. And in between all this, we're able to find little notes and diary entries in the apartment. These plot-driving sticky notes will make almost no sense to anyone up until the very end of the game, which I guess I can appreciate on some level, but it seems a bit odd to make so much of the exposition read like utter nonsense until someone's second playthrough. And to be honest, even after the game's ending, there's a good chance you'll still be in the dark with a lot of stuff, as this is one